Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. About 3 years ago, I moved into my current home in rural Vermont. Before that, I had lived in the same area for about a year. But we had to leave when the property owners decided to return and live there themselves. I'm still relatively young and live with my family, which makes everything that happened even more unsettling. From my bedroom window, I can see the fence of our backyard and a neighbor's house. Since this house sits on a small hill, the fence doesn't obstruct the view. My first encounter with this man happened on a cold autumn night. I was at home with friends, while our parents attended a community fundraiser several miles away. We were old enough to be responsible and stay by ourselves, and we were relaxed in my room. There were no lights or music playing, and even the TV had been turned off as we quietly talked. That's when my German shepherd started barking. Persistent, urgent barking that continued for several minutes. We didn't pay much attention at first, as she barks at everything from deer in the yard to leaves blowing across the porch. Then the sounds changed. Footsteps around the house and scratching noises coming from the walls put us on edge. That's when the louder, more frightening noises began, coming from the sliding glass door that led to the back deck. We rushed out of the room to investigate what was causing all the commotion. When we got there, we saw a large dog aggressively pounding against the glass. My usually fearless shepherd cowered behind me, with her fur completely raised. And then I saw him, a man dressed entirely in black, standing in front of the door. We froze for a moment, paralyzed by the unexpected sight of a stranger on our property at night. One of my friends, however, had quick instincts and ran to lock the door. The man reacted instantly, trying to hold it open. My friend shouted, "What are you doing here?" "Who are you?" The man responded in a strange, hollow tone. "I don't know." And then he retreated, taking his dog, which was attached to a leash. When our parents returned from the fundraiser, we told them everything. They asked why we hadn't called them. I knew we should have, but I didn't want to interrupt my father's speech at the event. It was a mistake I learned from. 2 days later, my mother approached our neighbor while he was mowing his lawn. He admitted it was him that night and claimed he had gone to retrieve his dog, which had supposedly gone through our gate. He said he had intended to speak with her beforehand, but ended up not doing so. At first, it seemed like a reasonable explanation, until I thought more carefully about the details. The gate he claimed his dog had passed through has a complicated latch that's difficult to open, and it was properly secured that night. He could only have opened it manually, which means he deliberately entered our yard with the dog. My suspicion is that he noticed the absence of lights and activity, concluded the house was empty, and decided to break in. The sounds we heard were probably him walking around my room before attempting to enter. After filing a police report, things remained quiet for several months. Then one night, as I was preparing for bed, something truly terrifying happened. I was almost asleep, adjusting my pillows, when I turned and saw a face outside my second-story window, staring at me. Whoever it was wore a black mask or face covering. I froze in terror and frantically texted my father downstairs. Moments later, I heard rushing footsteps as he came to check. But by then, there was no one there. I'm certain it wasn't my imagination. Normally, the lights from the neighbor's house are visible through the gap in my curtains, but the face blocked most of that light. This particular window is at least 15 feet above the ground, with no easy way for someone to reach it without a tall ladder. Since then, I've realized we're being watched frequently. Whenever I notice the fixed gaze, the person stands up from the porch of the house across the way and leaves, but not for long. I often catch him in the same spot just minutes later, always watching our house, particularly my window. At first, I told myself it might be coincidence. Perhaps he was just enjoying the evening air on his porch. But the pattern became undeniable. It always happened around the same time, always with that same intensity in his gaze, and always with that same retreat when he realized I had noticed him. I began keeping a log of these occurrences, noting dates, times, and how long it would take him to return. The consistency was chilling. Almost every night between 9 and 10, he would be there watching. If spotted, he would leave for approximately 8 to 12 minutes before returning to the same position. My parents took the situation seriously enough to install security cameras covering our property, especially the areas around my window. The cameras revealed something even more disturbing. On 3 separate occasions, they captured a tall figure carrying what appeared to be a ladder, moving along the perimeter of our property in the middle of the night. The figure always stayed just far enough away to remain partially obscured by trees and shadows. The police have been involved multiple times, but without clear evidence of trespassing or direct threats, they've been limited in what they can do. They've spoken to the neighbor, who denied any involvement and appeared offended by the accusations. According to official reports, he's been cooperative and has no criminal record, which only complicates matters. My family has considered moving, but the housing market in our area is challenging, and my parents' jobs keep us tied to this location. Instead, we've taken extensive security measures, motion-activated lights, reinforced locks on all doors and windows, and an upgraded alarm system. My room has been relocated to the other side of the house, facing away from the neighbor's property. Despite these precautions, I still feel watched. Sometimes, when driving home from school or work, I notice a black SUV that seems to appear too frequently on my route. It never follows me directly, just appears at strategic points along the way, parked or driving slowly. I've never been able to see the driver clearly or get a complete license plate number. The most unsettling aspect of all this is how it's changed me. I'm constantly vigilant, always looking over my shoulder, checking reflections in windows to see if anyone is behind me. Normal sounds at night now send my heart racing. The carefree teenager I once was has been replaced by someone who sees potential danger everywhere. Last month, something happened that convinced me this situation is even more serious than I thought. While home alone one afternoon, I received a plain envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of me walking across my college campus, clearly taken without my knowledge. There was no note, no explanation, just the photo with yesterday's date written on the back. I immediately contacted the police, who took the photograph as evidence. They're treating the situation with more urgency now, but I wonder if it's too late. This person, whoever they are, has been watching me for years. They know my routines, my habits, perhaps even my fears. What began as strange encounters has evolved into something that feels increasingly like calculated intimidation. Sometimes I find myself staring back at that house on the hill, wondering what drives someone to become so fixated on another person. What do they want? What are they waiting for? These questions haunt me as much as the face I saw at my window that night. For now, I continue living in a state of cautious awareness, hoping that whoever is watching eventually loses interest or makes a mistake that allows them to be caught. Until then, I keep the curtains drawn tight and try not to look outside after dark, afraid of seeing that face watching me once again. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Good evening. Though this is a rather short narrative, and perhaps doesn't contain impressive plot twists, I still feel a chill whenever I recall it. I'm originally from Maine and live with my family in a small apartment complex where the buildings face each other across a narrow courtyard. About 6 years ago, in one of these buildings lived an elderly woman named Vivian. She was remarkably energetic for her age and used to sell homemade cookies and sweets that delighted all the neighborhood children. One day, just before Thanksgiving, I observed from my bedroom window that she was hurriedly entering her apartment. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming she was just late or rushing for some reason. However, from that moment on, I didn't see her coming or going from her residence again. Several days later, on an afternoon when I was sitting on the balcony with my father and sister, I noticed several cars parking in front of her building. A group of people gathered outside Vivian's apartment, and my first impression was that it must be a family gathering. I found it strange that she didn't come out to greet them, as was her custom, but I didn't give it much importance. While these 6 or 7 people were conversing quietly among themselves, something peculiar happened. I saw Vivian walking out of her apartment, carrying a broom and dustpan. She walked calmly among the visitors without even looking at them. And the curious thing was that nobody seemed to notice her. Everyone remained engaged in their own conversation. Then she bent down, picked up a plastic bag that was on the ground, and calmly returned to her apartment. At that moment, I thought perhaps she had already greeted the guests before I noticed, and that's why she wasn't interacting with them. Still, I found her behavior a bit unusual. 4 days later, a friend of my mother informed us that Vivian had passed away almost a week earlier. That day when people were gathered in front of her apartment was actually a memorial service in her honor. I was completely stunned. I was absolutely certain I had seen her coming out of her apartment and walking among the people before returning inside. When I told my family about this, I discovered with surprise that my father and sister had also seen exactly the same thing. Since then, I've reflected on how, on certain occasions, spirits can appear so tangible that we don't even consider the possibility they are no longer of this world. That day we were witnessing something inexplicable, we were seeing a ghost. Sometimes I wonder if Vivian was simply completing one last task before moving on, or if she was checking to make sure everything was in order. Perhaps she didn't realize she had passed, or maybe she was making sure her friends and family would be all right without her. I still live in the same apartment, and sometimes when I look across at her old window, I could swear I see a shadow moving behind the curtains, though a new family has lived there for years. I've never told them about what I saw, but I often wonder if they've experienced anything unusual themselves. That's my story. I know it may not be as intense as others, but I wanted to share it with you. I'm from Vermont. In my early 20s, I lived about 40 minutes outside of Burlington. I had just ended a 2-year relationship, which marked a peculiar period in my life. It was that phase when you feel somewhat lost, trying to piece things together, and perhaps without realizing it, searching for some kind of purpose. My grandmother was deeply religious, attending church services with an almost unshakable devotion. After my grandfather's death, I began accompanying her to church every Sunday. At first, I went to support her, but over time, I realized that perhaps I myself was searching for something, even if I didn't know exactly what. My grandfather was a highly respected and admired veteran in our community. His passing left an immense void, especially in her life. Even amid her grief, her faith remained strong. She always said she believed he was now with the Lord, and this clearly brought her comfort. I admired that about her. Having a faith that offers that kind of peace is something rare, something I believe many seek throughout life, even without knowing how to express it. On one of these Sundays after the service, I met a young woman who seemed to have stepped out of a dream. I had never seen her before, which was curious since our community was small, and people knew each other well, especially at church. She had dark, curly hair and hazel eyes that immediately captured your attention. I waited until the end of the service to approach her. Part of me was simply enchanted by her appearance, but another part was intrigued to know who this stranger was, who seemed to be about my age. We started talking, and there was an immediate connection. You know that feeling of recognizing a spark with someone, as if everything fits together. Her name was Eliza, and she had a calm, engaging manner that captivated me. As we talked, I tried to learn more about her, asking about her family and her daily life, but with a teasing smile, she would change the subject, saying I'd need to take her out if I wanted to know more. That was charming. With some persistence and between jokes, she explained that her family had recently moved to the area and that she attended a college nearby, which explained why we had never crossed paths before. Before we parted, I got her number and was left with the exciting sensation of meeting someone new and interesting. The following week, we exchanged many messages and connected on social media. I remember scanning her Instagram, surprised at how few followers she had, but I liked that. I much preferred someone with whom I could create a genuine connection than someone who was already known by everyone. We talked about various subjects, and gradually she opened up more about her family life. I won't go into details, but her situation was complicated. Her stepfather was an alcoholic and frequently cruel to both her and her mother. Her biological father, according to her, was even worse, though she didn't give many details. Because of this, they had to move to escape him, which meant school transfers and leaving behind everything and everyone she knew. I avoided bringing up the subject of her father. I didn't want to invade her privacy. The mere fact that she was opening up already made me happy, despite finding her air of mystery fascinating. It was refreshing to get to know her on a more intimate level. I didn't rush to set up a date since I was sure I would see her again at church the following Sunday. And there she was. I took that as a sign and invited her out right after the service. Without hesitation, she smiled and accepted, agreeing to meet later in the week. I spent the rest of the days restless, thinking about her and anxious about our first date. When the night arrived, I opted for something simple. We watched a movie and had dinner. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet evening to talk and get to know each other better. To be honest, everything seemed to be going well. She had a charming way of listening, showing genuine interest, which was rare and refreshing. I didn't want the night to end so quickly, so after dinner, I suggested we take a walk. I thought it would be a good opportunity to continue talking away from the noise of the restaurant. We took the road, driving down one of those paths that are technically highways, but look like narrow roads with 2 lanes and dense trees on both sides. It was the perfect setting. What happened next is something I will never be able to fully explain. In the blink of an eye, everything changed. She started speaking suddenly, but it wasn't in English. The words came out rapidly, almost like a murmur, and seemed to be in some language similar to French. At first, I thought she was joking, or perhaps testing my reaction. But then I noticed something frightening. Her eyes rolled back, showing only the whites. My instinct was to swerve the steering wheel, and I almost hit the road barrier. My heart raced and panic took over. She seemed to be in some kind of trance, or perhaps having a seizure. With great effort, I controlled the car and pulled over to the shoulder, trying to stay calm despite panicking inside. I grabbed my phone and called emergency services, stuttering as I explained that I thought she was having a seizure. While I waited, I continued observing her, but it was as if she wasn't there. She was still murmuring, and her head seemed to vibrate in a way I had never seen before. I had no idea what to do. I was terrified, caught between the fear of touching her and the urgency to try to help. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. And then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped. She turned her head to look at me, closed her mouth and blinked, her eyes returning to normal. But what came next was even more disconcerting. She looked at me with a wild expression of wide eyes that I will never be able to erase from my memory. Before I could say anything, she opened the car door and, without saying a word, bolted toward the forest. Yes, you read that right. She simply ran into the woods without looking back. I tried to process what had just happened, but my body simply wouldn't react. My mind was racing, while my hands trembled uncontrollably. I remained motionless until the paramedics and police arrived. I reported everything, even though every word sounded absurd. I described her eyes, the way she murmured incomprehensible things, and how she ran into the forest. They listened attentively, noted my statement, and assured me they would do their best to find her, although I felt like someone out of their mind. They seemed to take me seriously. After that night, she vanished. I never saw her again. I returned to church on Sundays, hoping to find her, but it was in vain. Her Instagram disappeared, and my number was blocked. I was disconcerted when I asked a friend to send a message to her number, and discovered it no longer existed. Any attempt to search for her online was fruitless. It was as if she had never existed. I asked people at the church if they knew anyone named Eliza, but nobody seemed to know who I was talking about. Not even a glimmer of recognition. To this day, I don't know what happened to her. Maybe I never will. I no longer live in that region, and my memories of home now carry the weight of this incident like a puzzle, without a solution that accompanies me wherever I go. Sometimes I dream about her, always the same dream. She's standing at the edge of the forest, beckoning me to follow, but I always wake up before I can reach her. Was she real? Was she a spirit of some kind? Or perhaps something darker, something that needed a host and found me at a vulnerable moment? I'll never know for certain, but the memory of those haunting wide eyes still sends shivers down my spine on dark, quiet nights. I was following the route to deliver yet another order from the pizza place where I worked. The night was serene, and it was already past midnight. In the car, the sound of music filled the environment, while I concentrated on the routine of the delivery. On my way to the address, I stopped at a traffic light that had just turned red. The intersection was completely empty, but for some reason, the signal remained red for an absurdly long time. While waiting, I noticed that another car stopped beside me. I tried to avoid looking. Those moments of accidental eye contact are never comfortable. But something about the vehicle caught my attention. The windows were too dark, certainly beyond what the law allows, because I couldn't see absolutely anything inside. The car itself, all black, seemed like an older model, maybe a Cadillac. I'm not good with brands, but it caused me a discomfort that was difficult to explain. Maybe it was just the fact that we were alone there. I'm not sure exactly. Finally, the light turned green, and I proceeded forward. However, I noticed something strange. The other car didn't move. It remained stopped in the same place. I continued on my way, trying to leave that scene behind. Minutes later, I arrived at the delivery location, an area that, although it appeared residential, wasn't exactly a neighborhood. It was a street with about 15 houses aligned, ending in a dead end. The atmosphere there was unsettling. None of the houses had lights on, and for a moment I wondered if they were all abandoned. But the constructions were well maintained, with no signs of deterioration. I concluded it must be a coincidence that all the residents had their lights off at that hour. The address for the delivery was at the second to last house. I parked my car and walked to the door with the order in my hands. I expected to see at least some light through the windows, a sign that someone was inside, but everything was immersed in darkness. Already on the porch, I knocked on the door with some hesitation. As soon as I did, the door swung slightly, as if it were loosely closed or unlocked. That only made the situation even more unsettling. Pizza delivery. Is anyone there? The silence was absolute. No response, not even the slightest noise coming from inside. My instinct was to leave, but to avoid the risk of leaving the order at the wrong place, I pushed the door carefully. Inside, I saw an empty hallway and a room without any furniture or decoration. Not even a picture hanging on the walls. The only thing I noticed was the dust that began to rise slowly as the door opened. I quickly closed it and stepped away from the porch, feeling a mixture of confusion and apprehension. As I walked back to my car, something caught my attention on the road, a bit further back, near some of the previous houses. There was a black compact car, parked with its headlights off. It definitely wasn't there when I arrived. As soon as I noticed the darkened windows, a chill ran down my spine. It was the same car I had seen before. My face went cold as I realized this couldn't be mere coincidence. I began to quicken my pace, trying to reach my car as fast as possible. But when I was just a few meters away, something moved in the reflection of a window. I stopped in my tracks, not knowing exactly what I had just seen. Now close to the passenger door, I looked through the glass, and my gaze went straight to the back seat. The darkness made it difficult, but there was something partially blocking the window. I didn't need more than a second to understand what it was. Without thinking twice, I turned and ran back to the house. At that moment, I heard my car's back door open, and a man dressed in a black hoodie and equally dark pants jumped out of the vehicle. He didn't come after me. Instead, he ran directly to the road and got into the black car. I stood on the house's porch with my heart racing while dialing the police emergency number. I could have gotten into the car and fled at that moment, but the fear was paralyzing and my mind couldn't think clearly. When the police arrived, they brought a disturbing revelation. All of that street was unoccupied, since the houses were new constructions that hadn't been sold yet. This explained why they appeared so well maintained, but at the same time showed no signs of life. What I didn't expect was that in the previous month, they had received several reports similar to mine. Apparently, the modus operandi was always the same. The man would place an order with a fake name and address, and then follow the delivery person. What happened to me was the closest case of all until that moment. He had managed to get into my car and was probably waiting for me to return and perhaps drive to some secluded location. Who knows what he really intended to do? The police found a set of makeshift lock-picking tools when they swept the area. The officer who took my statement mentioned they'd had reports of delivery people going missing in neighboring counties, though they couldn't confirm if the cases were related. They advised all local delivery restaurants to implement new safety protocols, including calling ahead to confirm orders to unverified addresses and activating location tracking on drivers' phones. For months afterward, I found myself checking my backseat before getting into my car, even in broad daylight. I eventually quit that job and found work that didn't involve late-night deliveries to strangers' homes. Unfortunately, as far as I know, there hasn't been any update about his capture. To this day, I still can't shake the image of that empty house, or the realization that if I had been just a little less observant, I might not be here to tell this story. My family has a Jeep Cherokee from 2008 that's practically falling apart. The car has lived far beyond its expected lifespan, and for some inexplicable reason, it simply refuses to stop functioning. It's survived a mountain of mechanical problems, but continues to run, It has an endless list of defects. The brakes are loose, the engine has a mind of its own, and a good portion of the electronic systems practically don't work anymore. My parents are just waiting for the moment when it finally gives up for good to justify buying a new car. The problem is that I'm the one tasked with driving it. Besides all the obvious defects, the windshield wipers don't work anymore, which makes driving in the rain a risky adventure. Even a light drizzle transforms visibility into a dangerous blur. Fortunately, I live in New Mexico, one of the driest states in the country, so rain isn't something we worry about much. I remember in school, teachers loved to mention this fact, though I never really understood exactly why. Anyway, this story happened in the summer, a few years ago. I had just made a solo trip to visit my friend Cormac, who lives in another state. He's one of those friends you don't see for ages, but with whom the connection remains the same. I'm passionate about road trips, so I decided to turn the journey into a small adventure, crossing the desert alone and enjoying the desolate landscapes. The outbound trip was incredible. I spent a couple of nights at Cormac's place. We had a great time, drank leisurely, and it was all worth it. The return trip was going well until it wasn't. When I re-entered New Mexico, I was greeted by a furious storm. It wasn't a drizzle or a light rain, but a veritable torrent of water accompanied by lightning. I later learned it had been one of the most intense rainfalls in many years. I had driven in rain before, but this was something else entirely. With the broken wipers, any amount of water on the windshield was enough to force me to stop. And that's exactly what I did. I pulled off the highway and parked far enough from the pavement, fearing that some unaware truck might not see me. My only alternative was to wait and perhaps try to sleep right there in the car. I thought about calling the police to ask for help with the wipers, but I knew I was broke and couldn't deal with tickets or any other expenses. Besides, I doubted they would ignore the other obvious problems with the car. It also didn't make sense to ask my elderly parents to make a more than 3-hour journey just to come pick me up. I decided to stay where I was. I was parked alone in the middle of the desert while the storm raged around me. For an entire hour, not a single other car passed by, and the rain only seemed to increase as time went on. I began to feel something strange, an unsettling sensation, difficult to describe. For some reason, I felt an almost irresistible urge to move the car, even knowing it would be extremely dangerous in that situation. I kept looking repeatedly through the windows, as if expecting to see something out there. Of course, there was nothing but rocks and the endless desert. The sun was setting, and soon the entire landscape would be plunged into darkness. I hadn't planned to spend the night there, and the fact that the storm showed no signs of letting up began to make that possibility increasingly real. I confess that the idea of not being able to see what was outside made me uneasy. I'm not the type to panic easily, but the stories about the desert that I've heard were enough to keep me alert. As if the storm understood my thoughts, it began to show signs of easing, which calmed me down. Finally, it seemed that I would soon be able to resume my journey. The sun was setting, tinting the desert with that peculiar silent twilight hue. In other circumstances, perhaps I would have admired the beauty of that scenery. However, the persistent rain gave no respite, forcing me to remain in the same place. To distract my mind, I began observing the lightning that illuminated the horizon, trying to find some kind of solace in it. I have no idea how long I waited, but eventually darkness took over everything. That's when I decided that wasting energy unnecessarily was pointless. I decided that the best option would be to try to sleep a bit. However, just as I was closing my eyes, I noticed something unusual, flashes in the distance. These weren't lightning strikes this time. They were explosions of white light that leaped through the darkness in a disorderly manner, seeming to emerge from different places. The vision was deeply disturbing. I continued watching, and with each minute, those lights seemed to be getting closer. Soon it became clear they were coming straight in my direction. I felt my hands begin to sweat while my heart raced. I don't know exactly what motivated me, but an urgent instinct took over. Before I realized it, I was out of the car, hiding it behind a nearby rock formation. I grabbed my phone and ran with the rain streaming down my face. I let the icy water soak my clothes, but that hardly mattered. My heart felt like it wanted to leap out of my chest as I crouched, trying to make my breathing inaudible beneath the sound of the rain. From where I was, I could spy my car in the distance. After a few minutes, I identified what the flashes were: flashlights. 3 figures moved around my vehicle, each with a flashlight that swung erratically. It was as if they were staggering or dancing, behavior that didn't seem normal at all. I observed, increasingly tense, as they circled my car, examining it as if looking for something or someone. The disorderly way the flashlights oscillated gave the impression they were under the influence of some substance. I narrowed my eyes, trying to capture more details, but the darkness made this almost impossible. Suddenly, one of them raised a gun and fired into the air. The sound made me jump, and in the confusion, I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood. Everything in my body screamed for me to remain motionless, practically invisible behind the rock. I stayed there, frozen, while time seemed to drag on interminably. However, curiosity eventually overcame fear. Slowly, I peered from behind the rock again and felt a chill as I realized everything was dark. No flashlight illuminated the car anymore. My mind raced. Where were they? I waited, not knowing what to do, until suddenly the lights returned again. They blinked around the car as if mocking me, challenging my patience and courage. I realized I couldn't spend the night there. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, trying to dial the emergency number. My voice was barely audible as I explained in a whisper what was happening. I knew every word needed to be measured. My greatest fear was attracting unwanted attention. The operator assured me they would send help, and I hung up, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. The wait seemed endless, but finally I spotted the distant glow of the police cruiser lights. As soon as the characteristic flashing became visible, the 3 figures stopped what they were doing and fled, quickly disappearing into the darkness. When the officer parked next to my car, the strangers had already been gone for quite some time. Without wasting time, I ran through the rain toward the cruiser, waving my arms and feeling immensely grateful for that unexpected rescue. He listened attentively as I reported everything that had happened. What left me disconcerted was the fact that he didn't seem surprised by my story. Somehow that made everything even more disturbing. Despite this, He was kind enough to wait with me until the storm passed, and to my relief, didn't decide to tow the car. As we waited in his patrol car, he told me something that sent another chill down my spine. This particular stretch of highway had seen multiple similar incidents over the past year. In each case, travelers stranded by the weather reported seeing strange lights and figures before being robbed or worse. He mentioned that one family had been found wandering the desert 3 days after their car broke down, severely dehydrated and telling incoherent stories about people who weren't people. The officer never clarified whether he thought these were ordinary criminals taking advantage of stranded motorists or something more sinister. His parting advice was simply, next time, keep driving even in the rain. Whatever's out there in that desert is worse than any accident might be. I think about that night frequently since then. I've never had the courage to venture on a car trip alone again. Whatever or whoever those figures were, they were there for a reason, and I'm grateful I wasn't there to find out what it was. Hello, everyone. I want to share with you a story that I didn't experience directly, but was shared by a friend very close to my family. She worked at the old Riverside Psychiatric Hospital, which today is known as Oakwood Park. I'll tell you what she related to me, using the same words I heard. I started working at the clinic when I was 24 years old. Today, I'm 72. Before that, my job was in restaurants, serving as a waitress and attending to customers, nothing that had to do with nursing or anything similar. This would be my first experience in this type of environment. I ended up getting the job thanks to a neighbor who recommended me during a time when I was facing financial difficulties. I decided to risk taking the night shift as an aide, a role that basically involved distributing medications and organizing the stock, nothing too complicated. Or at least that's how it seemed at first. To be honest, I was a bit apprehensive, not because of paranormal things. In fact, I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. My fear was more real. Some patients, due to their conditions, could be quite aggressive. Still, when I was hired, I knew I couldn't afford to refuse the position because of some concern of mine. My shift was relatively short. It started at 7 in the evening and ended around 11. Although occasionally, I needed to cover other positions until 1 in the morning. In the first few weeks, I heard comments about inhumane practices at the hospital. They said they treated the patients like wild animals, without the minimum respect that any human being deserves. There were also circulating stories about patients who, without family to support them, mysteriously disappeared overnight, as if they were removed to make space in the hospital. I confess that to me, all of this seemed like nonsense, so I didn't pay much attention. Everything seemed normal until my 3rd week of work. One night, I needed to pass through a corridor that many avoided. The place had a reputation that, when walking through it, people felt observed. It was said that someone had abandoned their job after witnessing something in this corridor, something they never managed to overcome. I don't remember the exact time, but while walking to the storage room, I heard a noise of something falling to the floor. As I bent down to pick it up, I distinctly felt a hand touching my head. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. I stood up, still confused, and that's when I felt my hair being pulled. followed by an icy breath in my ear. I was terrified. I dropped everything and ran to a colleague to tell her what had happened. She, with a tone of jest, said that perhaps some patient had gotten up during the night and that I shouldn't worry. Nervously, I responded that there was absolutely no one there at the time. I noticed that my account made her uncomfortable, although she didn't say anything more. Still, she decided to accompany me to the corridor. We didn't see anything out of place. Everything seemed normal. But later, I discovered that other people had also gone through similar experiences in that same empty corridor. After that, fear accompanied me every time I needed to pass through there. But I couldn't simply quit the job. The salary was low, but I didn't have many alternatives. I continued anyway, facing the daily dread. And after all, how many of us have found ourselves trapped in a job we can't stand, but need to endure because we have no other option? I vividly recall another striking situation that I witnessed while preparing to end my shift. An elderly woman began to scream in such an anguishing way that we feared the other patients would become agitated, too. The scene we found was, at the very least, disturbing. The lady was in her room in a state of abandonment that was difficult to ignore, manipulating her own excrement. I won't go into details, but it was something very difficult to digest and forget. Additionally, she was babbling something in a language completely strange to me. Whether it was a known language or not, to this day I can't say. We tried to calm her, but nothing worked. Only when other staff members arrived, apparently trained to handle situations like this, were they able to control her. I withdrew extremely shaken. It was an experience that I consider both repulsive and frightening. After my shift ended, a colleague invited me to eat something at a taco stand near the hospital in an attempt to distract me from what had happened. While we were eating, he commented on rumors that, besides treating psychiatric patients, the place also served as a setting for exorcisms. He seemed certain that the lady we had attended to earlier wasn't just dealing with mental problems, but that there was something much darker happening to her. I responded with gentleness that I preferred to change the subject. Since the first strange experience I had, my view on these phenomena had changed, and I didn't want to feed my fear even more. He respected that. We changed the topic of conversation, but still, that night I couldn't sleep properly. The next day, I followed my usual routine. I took my son, who was 6 years old, to school in the afternoon shift, returned home, prepared lunch, and later went to pick him up to leave him at my sister's house before going to work. As we were walking, my son asked me a question that left me speechless. "Mom, who is the man who accompanies you when you come to pick me up?" Confused, I asked what he was talking about. According to him, there was a very old man who used to stand by my side, calmly observing as I waited for him outside my sister's house. He said he always saw this man, but as soon as he left the house, the gentleman would disappear. My first reaction was one of concern. I thought that perhaps some patient had managed to escape from the hospital and was following me. This alarmed me, especially when thinking about the safety of my son, my sister, and her daughter who was still small. The fear that someone might attack them made me question everything that was happening around me. The next day, I decided to report what my son had said to my superiors, but I was ignored. They said it was impossible for a patient to have escaped, and didn't even pay attention to my report. I left there frustrated and hurt, with the feeling of being helpless. Later, a colleague approached me to talk. She knew the reason for my complaint and commented that this type of report was more common among hospital workers than I imagined. It was a statement that, although it didn't solve anything, made me realize I wasn't alone in this sea of doubts and fears. She told me that what my son was seeing wasn't a person, but a spirit that had somehow attached itself to me. She warned that this wasn't something to be treated lightly, emphasizing the extreme care I should take. Although I knew she was trying to help me, I felt a deep irritation upon hearing those words. I asked her to never mention something like that again, and she simply apologized and walked away. Sometime later, I experienced something that completely transformed my view on these matters. It's difficult to admit, but the fear took on such proportions that I came to buy specific undergarments because I couldn't hold the urge to go to the bathroom during the night. Such was my apprehension. In that period, I constantly suffered from sleep paralysis. This led me to seek spiritual help, and a school friend performed an energy cleansing on both me and my son. The moment that really made me see everything with different eyes happened after almost 4 months of work. When I finally began to get used to, albeit with great difficulty, the conditions of the hospital, I had learned to ignore the disturbing sounds and the uncomfortable episodes that became increasingly common among the patients with whom I had contact. One of them caught my attention. Her clothes were so worn out that she seemed to be the person who had been there the longest. I never managed to see her face clearly, and in a way, I'm grateful for that. The precarious lighting of the place made the details indistinguishable. What I could notice was that her skin seemed covered in dirt. Her lips were alarmingly cracked, and her voice. Her voice, I prefer not to remember. It's as if my mind had erased the sound, perhaps as a defense mechanism. I can't even pronounce her name. One night, while checking the stock, I heard her voice behind me. "I want to show you something," she said. I replied that I would go as soon as I finished my tasks, but when I turned around, she had already vanished. Even against my will, I heard her voice again, this time a bit more distant. "Over here." I decided to follow her reluctantly and saw that she was walking toward the basement. I tried to warn her, saying she couldn't be there and that we needed to go back, but I was completely ignored. She opened a door with a clear warning of "Do not enter." That's when I heard desperate screams, almost as if someone was being tortured. Altered voices accompanied the sounds, angrily ordering someone to be quiet. I felt strangely compelled, almost hypnotized by the screams, and leaned in to get a better look. But at that instant, an employee appeared. He was visibly irritated, and with a firm tone, ordered me to leave immediately and return to my post. I tried to explain that a patient had entered there, and that I didn't know where she had gone. I begged him to check the place, but he simply ignored my words and repeated, even more forcefully, that I should leave. Having no choice, I obeyed, but I felt deeply restless. As I moved away, I began to recall the rumors that my colleagues shared. As much as they seemed like mere gossip, I couldn't help but question if there was more truth to them than I was willing to believe. That night, I didn't have the courage to share what had happened with my colleagues. To make matters worse, a security guard began to follow me in a subtle but perceptible way. Although he tried to disguise his movements, they didn't go unnoticed and only served to increase my restlessness and paranoia. The next day, I sought out a colleague responsible for patient care, someone who deeply knew each one of them. I asked if the lady I had seen the night before had returned to her dormitory. Her reaction was one of pure surprise and fear. With a frightened expression and a trembling voice, almost as if she were on the verge of tears, she responded, "That lady died about 2 weeks ago." "I don't know what you're talking about." "You must be confused, right?" A mixture of panic and incredulity took hold of me. I insisted, describing the woman in detail, and even mentioning the dormitory where I had found her to ensure we were talking about the same person. But my colleague left no room for doubt. It was the same lady. However, it was impossible for me to have seen her because she had already passed away. My brain refused to believe. I was certain that I had seen her, that I had even talked to her a week before that day. I had greeted her while attending to a specialist's request. How was this possible? I know that for many, this story seems absurd, and to this day, some people don't believe me. But I swear it wasn't imagination. I saw her as a normal person, flesh and blood. After this event, I decided I couldn't continue at the hospital anymore. I quit and distanced myself from everything related to that place. Despite the bond I created with some colleagues over time, I knew I needed to break any connection with the hospital. I even moved to another city because my house began to present strange events that I prefer not to bring to memory. My sister still lives nearby, but has a real dread of passing near the square where the hospital was located. When she goes to the movies, she and her family prefer more distant venues just to avoid that place. My son, on the other hand, doesn't recall anything of what happened at the time. I came to tell him, but it's as if these memories simply don't exist for him. And sincerely, I am grateful to God for that. Today, I no longer fear the supernatural, although I've decided to avoid horror movies. It was a long road until I managed to talk about this, but I thought it important to share. So I thank you for listening and for allowing me to finally tell this story. What strikes me most about her account is how matter-of-fact she was when telling it. Not once did her voice waver, not even when describing the most disturbing parts. I asked her once if she ever tried to research the history of the hospital or find reports of similar experiences. She just shook her head and said, "Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again." I've said my piece. That's all I want to say about it. The hospital was demolished in 2010. In its place now stands a community park where children play and families gather for picnics. I've visited it several times, and while it's beautiful during the day, I can't help but feel a certain unease when the sun begins to set. Perhaps it's just knowing what once stood there, or perhaps something of what happened in that building still lingers, even after all these years. Good evening. I've been following accounts of strange experiences and paranormal encounters for several months. I'm from Oregon, and I've noticed there are few stories related to my region compared to the legends we commonly know around here. Recently, I heard an episode about doppelgangers, and I remembered an occurrence at my home that I can describe as something out of the ordinary. I'd like to share my experience, but I request that my name not be mentioned. This situation occurred in 2019, when I was 17 years old. On that day, I was alone at home waiting for my parents to arrive. My father called me while he was in the car, letting me know they were nearby, and suggesting that I walk to my sister's house to meet them so we could have lunch together. Shortly after that call, I heard someone arriving. It was my mother. I was surprised, since the plan was for both of them to go directly to my sister's house. "Mom, you came home. I thought you were going straight there with Dad." My mother didn't enter the house, but our dog ran to her, happy as always. She left her umbrella leaning against the window and responded, "I'm going to check on the garden." Since my parents always took great care of their vegetable garden, I didn't find it strange. I imagined she just wanted to make sure everything was in order before we left. However, time passed, 10 minutes, 20, 30, and she didn't return. I became worried and went out to see if she needed help. But as soon as I reached the backyard, a strange feeling took hold of me. It was as if something heavy was pressing on my chest, and an inexplicable wave of dread overwhelmed me. I looked around, but there was no one there. The window where the umbrella had been before was now empty. I went back inside the house, grabbed my cell phone, and called my father. "Dad, have you arrived yet?" I asked. "Yes, we just got here." "Come quickly." Without mentioning what had happened, I locked the house, took the keys, and walked to my sister's house. As soon as I arrived, I recounted the occurrence. My mother looked at me in surprise, but only said, "It must be my soul that arrived first." In my family, it's common for us to experience events that defy explanation. All of us believe in the existence of spirits, negative energies, demons, and such things. Perhaps that's why my mother wasn't so impressed. However, upon hearing that episode about doppelgangers or malignant entities, I recalled this experience, and for some reason, the fear I felt that day returned with even greater force. The most disturbing part of the memory is how real she seemed. It wasn't like seeing a transparent figure or a shadow. It was her, exactly as I'd always known her. The dog recognized her too, which makes me wonder what kind of entity could fool even an animal's senses. After that day, I started noticing other small oddities around the house. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps when everyone was accounted for. Objects would disappear and reappear in places no one had put them. More than once, I thought I saw someone walking past a doorway, only to find the room empty when I checked. My mother never experienced anything unusual herself, which I find strange. If it was her soul arriving first, as she suggested, wouldn't she have felt something? A premonition, a sense of displacement, or some kind of awareness. I've researched doppelgangers extensively since then. In many cultures, they're considered omens of misfortune or even death. I was terrified for weeks, watching my mother for any sign of illness or accident, but nothing happened. She remained perfectly healthy and still is today. Perhaps what I saw wasn't a doppelganger in the traditional sense. Some theories suggest these apparitions could be glimpses of parallel realities or timelines momentarily intersecting with our own. Maybe I briefly saw a version of my mother from a slightly different reality, one where she did come home first instead of going straight to my sister's. What troubles me most is the feeling that came over me in the backyard. It wasn't just surprise or confusion at not finding her there. It was a deep, primal fear, as if something fundamental about reality had been violated. I still get goosebumps remembering that sensation. I've never told anyone outside my family about this, and even with them, I've only mentioned it once or twice. There's something deeply unsettling about questioning your own perceptions, about wondering if what you saw with your own eyes could somehow not be real, or worse, be something pretending to be real. I still live in the same house, though I've since moved into the basement as my own apartment. Sometimes, when I'm alone and hear a car pull up outside, I feel a moment of dread before looking out the window. I'm always afraid I'll see my mother arriving home when I know for certain she's somewhere else. I'd be interested to know if anyone has had a more direct encounter with these beings, or what they might actually be. All I know is that whatever I saw that day, it wasn't truly my mother, despite looking exactly like her in every way. Greetings from Oregon. I hope sharing this experience might help me understand what happened, or at least let me know I'm not alone in experiencing something so inexplicable. It was near the end of autumn, during the first days of November. A close friend, one of those with whom you share not just laughter, but also responsibilities, planned to travel with his family for 7 days. He asked if I could take care of the house during this period. As we had a solid friendship between our families, this kind of arrangement wasn't unusual. To be honest, I had done this for them the previous year as well. Their house was full of life, aquariums teeming with fish, and a variety of plants that needed constant attention. In exchange for taking care of all this, I could spend the week at their house. Coming from a tiny studio apartment, this offer was always welcome. I arrived a few hours before their departure, taking the opportunity to review the tasks and familiarize myself with everything once more. As soon as they left, I arranged my things, settled in, and around 6 in the evening, I went out to get something to eat. I returned with dinner and made myself comfortable in the living room, turning on the TV to relax while I ate. Just 30 minutes later, I heard knocking at the door. I paused the program and went to see who it was. Outside stood a man who appeared to be in his 30s. He wasn't wearing a delivery uniform or anything that might explain his visit. He just looked like an ordinary person. I opened the door enough to talk with him and asked what he needed. He seemed surprised to see me, but quickly composed himself and asked for my friend, mentioning him by name. I thought he might be an acquaintance or something similar, but I informed him that my friend was traveling and suggested he return another day. The man didn't insist or ask questions. He simply left. I could have asked more about the reason for his visit, but I thought that if it were important, he would have explained it himself. Even so, I sent a message to my friend to tell him about the visit. He returned with a phone call, and after a brief conversation, it became clear that he had no idea who that man could be. Initially, I decided not to give it much importance. I continued watching TV, then watered the plants and fed the fish. Around 9 o'clock, I began preparing the sofa to sleep, adjusting blankets and organizing everything to spend the night. While I was finishing arranging the space, I heard another knock at the door. This time, I felt immediate discomfort when I realized it was the same man. "What do you want? Can you come back another time?" I shouted through the door, trying to sound firm. I watched as the man remained there, quiet, with an expression that seemed to be weighing the possibilities. He looked at the door, but instead of responding, he turned around and left again. I locked the door carefully and returned to the sofa, trying to understand what had just happened. Perhaps I should have called the police at that moment, but I hesitated. I was in someone else's house and didn't want to cause alarm for something that could be just a misunderstanding. After all, the man hadn't done anything other than appear twice and stand at the door. It seemed like a flimsy reason to involve the authorities. I imagined how it would sound. He appeared twice and just stood there quietly. A bit absurd, right? However, the episode left me uneasy, and sleep seemed impossible at that moment. I took my cell phone and kept watch with the curtains slightly open to observe the outside. I waited attentively for at least 2 hours, until fatigue began to weigh on my eyes. Before lying down, I checked the windows once more. I closed the curtains, brushed my teeth, and took a quick shower to alleviate the nervousness. When I came back downstairs, less than 10 minutes had passed. I turned off all the lights, preparing the house for the night, but something was bothering me. I decided to take one last look at the windows. Outside, everything seemed peaceful. The trees swaying gently in the wind, the street completely deserted. It was a scene that should bring peace, but something didn't feel right. As I moved away from the window, my gaze was drawn to the front door. I noticed something strange about the lock. I went over there, imagining it might just be my mind playing tricks, but it wasn't. The door was unlocked, and I was absolutely certain I had locked it earlier. There was no doubt. For an instant, I froze. I felt adrenaline rushing through my veins as panic took over. I took a deep breath and moved slowly toward the sofa where I had left my phone, but it wasn't there. Someone had already taken it. Without thinking twice, I grabbed the keys and ran out the front door. Outside, I got into my car and pressed the emergency button to call the police. I drove away from the house and parked a few meters away, waiting for the authorities to arrive. When the police arrived and searched the house, they found the man, the same one who had appeared twice, sitting calmly in one of the guest bedrooms. He seemed completely oblivious to the situation, without saying a single word. They searched him and found a bump key in his pocket, a replica that could open the front door. Nobody knew how he had obtained it. My friend, when informed of the incident, reaffirmed that he had no idea who the man was or what he might want. However, there was something strange in the way he reacted. There seemed to be something he didn't want to or couldn't tell me. Since then, our communication has become rare and distant. The police never got a straight answer from the intruder. He remained almost catatonic during questioning, speaking only to give basic identification information. No criminal record, no clear motive, nothing that explained his behavior. They charged him with breaking and entering, but without evidence of theft or violent intent. He was released after a psychological evaluation pending trial. What haunts me to this day is what would have happened if I hadn't noticed the unlocked door. If I had gone to sleep that night, would I have woken up at all? What was his real intention? And why did my friend react so strangely when I told him who had broken in? I've developed a habit of checking every lock 3 times before bed. I never stay at anyone else's house anymore, and I've installed a security system in my own apartment that would make a bank vault look vulnerable. To this day, I wonder if the man was just a random burglar who picked the wrong house, or if there was something more targeted about his choice. The way he asked for my friend by name suggests the latter, which opens up a whole host of unsettling questions I'm not sure I want answered. Sometimes I think about reaching out to my old friend to clear the air, to ask him point blank what he knows. But then I remember the look on his face when I described the intruder, not surprise or concern, but recognition quickly masked by something else. Fear, guilt, I couldn't tell. Until today, I still don't know what his real intentions were. But I often think about what could have happened if I hadn't noticed the unlocked door. If I had gone to sleep that night, perhaps I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Imagine moving to a new home full of promises and dreams, only to realize that something isn't right from the moment you step inside. Small events that individually might seem like coincidences or the product of a tired mind begin to add up until you can no longer ignore the signs that something darker is at play. It's the kind of experience that redefines what you consider home and makes you question the supernatural that might dwell around us. I want to begin by saying that horror stories have always stirred my curiosity, though they also carried a touch of apprehension. Not that I was skeptical about what could happen, quite the contrary. In my family, even before my birth, terrifying episodes occurred involving a shadowy figure. A woman dressed in black who, according to them, materialized in our house. Legend has it that her last appearance was beside my crib when I was still a newborn. The way this presence marked my family's memory and the terror with which they speak of her pushed me away from these stories as much as possible. Still, I couldn't avoid the peculiar interest they always awakened in me. Everything began in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. I was born and raised in El Paso, Texas. But when I decided to move in with Derek, my boyfriend at the time, and now my husband, he suggested we move across the border to his hometown, where we thought we'd have better chances of starting the business we were planning together. A friend of his helped us find some housing options. Among all the houses he showed us, one immediately caught my attention, while the others were simple and needed renovations. This one was a charming 2-story house with a small backyard that seemed ideal for a garden. It was so perfect, it almost seemed like a joke. Without thinking too much about the values, I trusted that Derek had included it on the list because it was within our budget to rent. There was only one peculiarity. The owner required several months of rent paid in advance, which would not be returned if we broke the lease. We moved in on a Tuesday in August of 2019. The blazing sun made the day feel even longer as we drove there. I held Maxwell, my 15-year-old terrier, on my lap during the journey. When we arrived at the house, 2 friends were already there to help, and with my father assisting, they unloaded the furniture quickly. I remember the feeling of satisfaction when entering that closed street, so calm and quiet. The house was exactly as in the photos, and that filled me with joy. But as soon as I crossed the front door for the first time, something strange happened. It was like feeling a dry blow to the stomach, not strong, but enough to leave me breathless for a moment, as if a child had gently pushed me. Maxwell refused to enter, and I attributed this to his desire to play with Derek's friends, as he loved receiving affection from anyone. I had to pick him up, so he would finally go inside. We spent the rest of the day arranging things in the house. Even with the few pieces of furniture we brought, we managed to put everything in its proper place. My father decided to sleep in the master bedroom that Derek and I wouldn't use. It was strange, dark, with a view of the backyard, and didn't seem welcoming to us. Derek and I stayed in another smaller room with a window facing the street, which I liked better. It had probably been an office in the past. When night fell, I noticed Maxwell scratching at the door to get out. Derek opened it for him, and we left him to wander around. That night I had restless dreams filled with nightmares, but no matter how hard I tried, I could never remember the details. What woke me in the morning was the sound of crying. It was my father. The dawn was still timid when we went downstairs to see what had happened. There by the door, we found Maxwell lying, as if asleep forever. He had apparently died during the night. It was a devastating moment, one of the most intense pains I've ever felt, as if they had torn away a part of me. Maxwell had been by my side since I was a child. He wasn't just a dog. He was an essential part of my history and my life. My father, now calmer, tried to comfort me. He said Maxwell had probably held on long enough just to see the new home and make that journey with me. He believed the poor dog was already tired, but knew he needed to hold on a little longer to accompany me through this important moment. The strangest thing happened that afternoon when we started looking for a place where we could bury him. I asked Derek if Maxwell seemed normal when he opened the door to let him out of the room. To my surprise, Derek replied that it hadn't been him who opened it. He was certain I had done it. I found that strange because I remembered hearing the door open during the night, but I hadn't opened my eyes, believing Derek had taken care of it. I even heard the characteristic sound of the stiff doorknob that we had commented on the previous night, saying we would need to lubricate it. Derek insisted he had seen me open the door. He said he woke up and saw me standing next to it, with something resembling a sheet covering my shoulders and neck. "Are you sure that's how you saw me?" I asked incredulously, because if it wasn't me, then who was it? A woman could have entered our house. He tried to joke about the situation, but I asked him to be serious. I swore I hadn't gotten up during the night, but he preferred to change the subject, perhaps to avoid making me even more disturbed. Maybe he thought I was blaming myself for allowing Maxwell to leave, imagining that if he had stayed with us, we could have heard him if he was sick. Or perhaps he wouldn't have even gone down the stairs. However, something inside me said there was more to this story. My father wanted to stay longer, but needed to return to El Paso. I asked him to drive carefully, especially since he would be facing the road at night. Although he had made that journey countless times, he hadn't done it in many years. We spent some time on the sidewalk, saying goodbye, sad. Before leaving, he promised to let me know as soon as he arrived, no matter the hour, and I insisted he call or send at least a message. Even though Maxwell spent only one night in that house, when we entered again, the environment was impregnated with an overwhelming sadness. The solitude seemed palpable. My eyes fell upon his bed, his toys, and I couldn't contain myself. I collapsed right there, overcome by a pain that seemed unbearable. As I cried, I heard from the bathroom my husband's voice murmuring something like, "Ridiculous old woman." A mix of indignation and anger took over me. I shouted, asking how he could say something so cruel, especially after spending 2 years declaring affection for Maxwell, pretending that he also meant something to him. At that moment, I hated Derek with all my strength. Derek came out of the kitchen holding a cup of tea, and confused, asked what I was talking about. I told him what I had just heard, and he affirmed he hadn't said anything, much less from the bathroom. But I knew what I had heard. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't confusion. A male voice had come from there, an unmistakable whisper. I got up and went there to check, feeling even more uncomfortable and restless. The whole context of the new house and the unfamiliar city was already enough to leave me vulnerable. But losing Maxwell at that moment intensified everything. He was my last direct link to my childhood, to my mother, and now that connection had disappeared. The feeling of emptiness and restlessness seemed to take root in that space, as if something invisible was also present. Something in that house always seemed to be lurking. I had the constant sensation that in the shadows of each room, there were eyes watching me. Where light didn't reach, the darkness seemed to shelter an invisible, more oppressive presence. My heart was racing. The only thing I wanted at that moment was for my father to call. But I avoided sending him a message to not distract him and risk causing an accident. When the phone finally rang, I answered before the first ring was complete. "Hello?" I asked, trying to control my anxiety. On the other end, I heard only the distant sound of an engine, a short silence that felt like an eternity. "Daughter, are you okay? Everything quiet over there?" My father's voice was different. He was still on the road, but spoke in a way that only parents can, worried, trying to hide something so as not to frighten me. I replied that everything was fine, that I just wanted him to arrive safely so I could sleep peacefully. "Something happened just now. I had to stop on the shoulder, but I'm okay, don't worry. I'm passing through San Benito. Something very strange happened. Let me start the car again, and I'll tell you." I asked him not to drive while talking on the phone, so he put it on speaker. I got up from the bed, so as not to wake Derek, and continued the conversation. "Something appeared in front of me, daughter. Something strange. A woman was standing in the middle of the road. She was tall, very thin, all dressed in black. But daughter, I don't know how to describe it. She seemed, the pause that followed was anguishing. My father took a deep breath before saying, 'It was death, daughter.' I saw her face. I stayed on the line until he arrived home. He tried to disguise his fear, but it was evident that he needed my company, even from a distance. We only hung up when he entered his house, safe." Derek, who had heard the entire conversation due to the absolute silence in the house, looked at me fixedly. "He said he saw someone on the road," he asked with hesitation. Still trembling, I confirmed, saying that my father believed he had seen death. Derek suddenly got up, sat on the bed, and turned on the lights. Without saying anything, he began to turn on all the lights in the house, passing through every corner, every room, inspecting with attention. I asked him to stop, to explain what he was doing. He pulled a sofa near the front door, where we had found Maxwell, and called me to sit with him. I don't know if everything that happened with Maxwell has left me impressed, or what your father said, but I feel there's something here. My friends, when they came to help us unload things, commented that they thought there was already someone in the house. They said they saw a person looking through the window and even waved, but that person didn't respond. I said there was no one, and after that, they didn't even want to talk about it anymore. Did you notice they left as quickly as they could yesterday? He paused, his gaze heavy with apprehension. When your father left, I swear I saw something in the back of his truck. It seemed like there was someone with him. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to scare you. I couldn't say, "Sir, don't go. I think you're taking a ghost with you." Derek held my hand and continued with a tone that mixed guilt and fear. "Forgive me for not telling you before. Please forgive me. I believe I managed to remain firm and mature while we lived through all this, because I witnessed two men who had always been strong, Derek and my father, crumble like children. Their voices carried the weight of fear. Their eyes showed the vulnerability they tried to hide. Seeing this forced me to be the fortress, but inside, fear was also consuming me. That night was a nightmare. We barely managed to sleep. The street of the house seemed deserted, as if no one lived there. It was a private street, too quiet. There was no sound of dogs, no footsteps, no voices. It was as if silence was a rule. Strangely, all the cars were in their places. It wasn't the heat that kept people inside their houses, since the weather was pleasant. Something seemed wrong. The next morning, around 9, we saw a young couple walk down the street. However, as soon as they reached the height of our house, they crossed to the other side. When they passed it, they crossed back and continued on their way. It was then that we began to observe the neighboring houses. The windows of the house to the left were sealed with wooden boards. In the house to the right, it seemed they had been mended. No window facing us was open. All seemed closed forever. When investigating the back part that opened onto another street, we noticed something peculiar. While the entire wall surrounding the private street was just cement, right behind our house, there was a wooden fence added on top of the wall, blocking the view beyond it. The feeling that something was wrong was undeniable. I decided that the best thing to do would be to meet the neighbors under the pretext of introducing myself and saying that we planned to live there for quite some time. I went to some nearby houses, but people barely gave me attention. They greeted me from inside their doors without opening them, saying only the essentials and clearly wanting me to leave. A gentleman who appeared to be in his 50s and was washing his car couldn't dodge when I approached. He responded mechanically with yes, 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 as if he wasn't even listening. I commented that I wanted to meet the neighbors because we expected to live there for quite some time, and he finally reacted, laughing sarcastically. "Look at that, quite some time." I asked why he said that, since we had just arrived and didn't know the previous residents. At this moment, he raised his eyes as if he was going to say something important, but he held back and focused on the car again. It was then that a woman, probably his wife, called me from inside the house. She didn't open the metal door that separated us, but her voice crossed the barrier. "You really don't know anything about who lived there before." I explained that I didn't. She seemed to get a little closer to the door. Her voice became calmer, almost whispered. Take a good look at the marks. They didn't have much time to fix them. Start at the entrance, at the main door. Terrible things happened in that house. Horrible people lived there. She paused as if evaluating whether she should continue, then completed. But the worst of all wasn't what happened while there were residents. It was what happened when the house was empty, with all entrances sealed by the police. What happened in my house? Who lived there? I asked. But the only response was the sound of the neighbors breathing before she closed an inner wooden door, leaving me alone again. I ran to Derek and asked if he knew anything. He assured me he didn't, that no one had mentioned anything strange about the house. One of his friends had accompanied the realtor to verify if everything was as advertised. And yes, it seemed to be in good condition. But we went to look for the marks. We started with the main facade. Despite the renovation the house had undergone, it was still possible to notice small vestiges. By lightly scraping some areas, it seemed evident that they were patches made over bullet marks. We decided to try to forget about it and sleep. The next day, we would have time to investigate more. However, the night was far from peaceful. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by a familiar sound, the one Maxwell used to make when he wanted me to open the door. For a moment, I completely forgot where I was and what had happened. "I'm coming." "Wait just a bit," I murmured as I got up. But as soon as I opened my eyes, everything came back to memory. Maxwell was no longer there. "Don't move," whispered Derek, his voice low and trembling. "Sleep, close your eyes. Don't turn to the door, please. Don't look at the door." His tone froze me. I didn't know what he was referring to, but I tried to obey slowly. However, I soon realized that Derek was crying. A low, suffocated cry that only comes from someone overtaken by fear. "What is it? What's happening?" I insisted. "Tell me or I'm going to get up." Derek was trembling so much that he seemed incapable of responding. I could feel his panic, but even so, something inside me, perhaps a mixture of fear and morbid fascination, made me want to look. My heart felt like it was going to explode, but curiosity, or perhaps terror, was stronger. After minutes of pretending to be asleep, I slowly turned. Derek tried to stop me, but I had already decided. I turned to the door, keeping my eyes closed, breathing deeply, gathering courage to open my eyes, trying to face whatever was there. When I finally half opened them, the first thing I noticed was that the door was slightly ajar. We were certain we had closed all the doors before sleeping, locking them several times, concerned with security. The doors of that house weren't common, light, or hollow. They were all solid wood, heavy, with robust locks. But now the door was open. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see more details, and then I saw her, a figure standing motionless at the entrance to the room. It was the most terrifying face I've ever seen in my entire life. A woman. Her hair was uneven, as if she only had strands on the left side of her head, near the ear. She smiled in a way that didn't seem natural, an empty smile without teeth, or at least that's what it seemed. And the eyes, they were the worst of all. One of them was normal, but the other stretched in an impossible way, as if it went up to the forehead, looking like an elongated drop. My throat exploded in a scream so strong it hurt, a scream that I'm certain echoed throughout the private street. However, no one reacted. No light turned on, no window opened, No one asked if we were okay. That deafening silence only made everything even more terrifying. Derek and I, overcome by panic, threw ourselves as we could from the veranda and ran to the car, locking ourselves inside. We stayed there for some time, trying to regain control, until we decided to return to the house. Fortunately, I had left the keys in the car, which facilitated our entry. It was at this moment that Derek confessed something that left me even more restless. He had already seen that woman before, in the empty room. Before we laid down, he went upstairs to check the doors while I waited for him in our room. And there she was, in the middle of the room, looking through the window directly at the wooden fence built in the house behind. Derek initially thought it was me, but soon realized it wasn't. Terrified, he tried to disguise it, insisting that we check all the locks before sleeping. But fear was already consuming him. The truth is that we endured only 2 nights in that house. Less time, apparently, than the previous family. Derek decided to use the property as a storage place for the remainder of the contract, going to the location only during the day and always accompanied by his 2 friends, who were now his business partners. With time, they managed to gain the neighbors' trust, who finally revealed what they knew. The house had been the hideout of a couple of drug traffickers, cruel and merciless people. The neighbors knew of their activities, but didn't dare denounce them, because even police patrols occasionally appeared to chat amicably with the criminals before leaving. Who could they ask for help? The only way out was to ignore what was happening there. But the neighbors' silence was broken when the traffickers began to perform disturbing rituals. They did this with open doors, as if they wanted everyone around to witness and fear. Something in that house seemed to feed on people's fear, growing with each new act of cruelty. The situation reached its apex when the house was used to hide a kidnapping victim. One morning, shots woke the neighborhood residents, and police officers and soldiers took over the place, knocking on doors and ordering some to leave, while others took refuge in the safest rooms of their houses. The siege lasted hours until the 2 criminals surrendered. What most intrigued the neighbors was what the police and soldiers said. Many claimed to have seen someone else in the window of the house, a 3rd individual. However, this person was never found. For the victim, unfortunately, it was too late. This story never made it to the news. It only circulated on Facebook pages and WhatsApp groups. But the local accounts were clear. Something dark had remained in that house after the traffickers' arrest. People said that 3 entities remained there. One of them was the woman I saw, with her distorted eyes and macabre smile. Another was a tall figure dressed in black, whose half of the face seemed like a skull. This last one, for some reason, followed my father to El Paso. But that's something I can only tell on another occasion. Today, I can only ask that if you know of a place where crimes of this type happen, where evil is worshipped, abandon everything and leave as quickly as you can. No matter what you leave behind, stop and go. Derek and I are living proof of the impact that 2 days in a place like this can cause. Whoever sees us today easily notices it. It's as if we've aged 10 years in just 2 nights. One of the most curious advantages of your family owning a bar is knowing that one day this space will be yours. For a long time, I worked alongside my father, managing the business. I did everything, served at the counter, prepared meals in the kitchen, and even took care of some bureaucratic matters whenever time allowed. However, a few weeks ago, my father left us, and that made me the sole person responsible for running the bar. One of the regular patrons, an elderly gentleman named Edward, was visibly shaken upon learning of my father's death. He cried uncontrollably, something that completely caught me by surprise. I've worked in this bar for more than 2 decades and have known Edward since the beginning. I had never seen him so fragile. Edward is a large man with speech marked by a slight accent that I could never quite identify. I'm terrible at deciphering these things. Despite this, over the years, he became something close to a friend. Outside my family, there's no one with whom I maintain such a long connection. I know that he and my father were already acquainted before the bar even existed, but I never discovered how they met. Throughout the years, Edward had been a faithful customer. He would sit on the same counter stool, conversing with my father while displaying his iconic white beard and equally white hair tied in a ponytail. He was unmistakable. He always dressed in dark green, as if there were no other colors in his wardrobe, and loved sharing extraordinary stories that always drew good laughs. So seeing him so desolate deeply affected me. In tribute to my father, I served Edward several rounds on the house that night. When I finally closed for the night, Edward was still sitting in the same place, in no condition to drive back. I observed the man, now lost in his thoughts, and said, "Come on, my friend. Today you're not getting behind the wheel. I'll take you home." I knew exactly where he lived since it wasn't the first time I had helped him. Edward lived about 30 minutes from the bar in a remote part of Vermont, and the journey was quick even with closed traffic lights. After finishing the cleaning and turning off the lights, I turned to him again. "Let's go, Edward." "It's time to go," I insisted, but he remained motionless. I sat down beside him, putting my arm around his shoulders in an attempt to comfort him. I still can't get out of my head what happened next. Edward, with a weak voice full of emotion, finally spoke. "I'm not who you think I am. When you reach my age, death makes you reflect on many things." I just nodded and gave a slight squeeze on his shoulder, with no idea what to say. Edward then raised his enormous hand and slammed it on the bar counter with force. He stared at me, tears running down his face, and poured out his heart. "I've done things you can't even imagine. Where I grew up, there weren't many options to survive. This was the only way out. And I liked it. I liked what I did. I never thought I would feel this way." Never. Edward was visibly drunk, and his mind was not in a stable state. "It's all right, my friend. Let's get you out of here. It seems like what you need now is to rest a bit." I spoke calmly as I got up. To my surprise, he rose with quickness, something impressive for someone of his age and state. His gigantic figure made me look like a doll next to him. Before I could react, he grabbed the collar of my shirt and shook me as if I were made of cloth, while shouting with raw pain in his voice, "You don't understand. I did terrible things. I'm not a good person. Every night I see the faces. They never leave me in peace." My heart raced. Edward had cornered me, and my back was already pressed against the wall. At that moment, his words made no sense to me. What mattered was finding a way to calm him down. But without warning, He abruptly turned around and sat down again on one of the stools, now sobbing once more. "You think you know me. Your father, he knew, and now he's gone, like all the others." He began to shout words I didn't recognize, probably in another language. Fury took hold of him. Edward threw stools and knocked over tables, leaving the bar in complete chaos. My keys and my phone were behind the counter, out of my reach, and all I could do was cower in a corner, helpless as he completely lost control. Finally, Edward turned one last time in my direction. His eyes were intense, almost desperate, when he declared, "The faces won't chase me anymore. I won't allow it." And in an impressively agile movement for his age, he ran out of the bar. I remained paralyzed on the floor for several minutes, trying to assimilate what had just happened. When I finally regained control, I ran to follow him, but he had already disappeared. I took my keys and drove through the nearby streets, searching every corner, but there was no sign of him. It was hard to believe that someone his age could have gone very far, but the roads were completely deserted. I went to his house, knocked on the door repeatedly, but no one answered. Desperate, I decided to call the police and report everything. They recorded the occurrence, but Edward never returned home that night. The strangest thing is that to this day, he remains missing. There's no trace of him, alive or dead. His car is still parked in front of his house, but Edward simply vanished. The police didn't find any relatives or anyone close we could turn to. His house gave no clues about where he might have gone, and now, as I write this, I know he's still out there somewhere. Honestly, I just hope he's okay. For years, Edward was someone with whom I shared personal stories, someone I genuinely cared about. Seeing him crumble that way was devastating. Some memory, some deep secret that he had kept for a long time, finally surfaced. And whatever it was that he faced in his past, it seems it became an unbearable weight. A week after his disappearance, I received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, my father and Edward standing in military uniforms. On the back, in shaky handwriting, "He saved me in Vietnam. I couldn't save them. Now they're coming for me too." I never showed the photo to the police. Some things are better left undisturbed, and somehow I understood that Edward had finally found his peace, one way or another. He appears outside my bedroom almost every night. It's been happening for years now. He seems to be around 6 feet tall, if I could hazard a guess. He's an elderly man, probably past 70 years of age, always wrapped in several layers of clothing, which makes it difficult to estimate his weight or physique. To be honest, I can't affirm with certainty that it's a man. I use that pronoun more out of convention than conviction. What I know with absolute certainty is that he has never crossed the threshold of my bedroom door, but he's tried. Most times, he just stands still on the balcony outside the glass doors, pressed against them. He manages to access the balcony through an external staircase. Last March, I decided to dismantle the steps, thinking that would keep him away. It worked for one night. The following day, however, I found the mutilated and crushed body of my cat, who was 16 years old, pushed through the mail slot in the front door. I immediately dropped everything I was doing and rebuilt the staircase, that very same night. He appeared for the first time in his complete form, shortly after that incident. At the time, there were no curtains covering the glass doors. His face was pressed against the glass, with the lower part of his face clearly visible, while a voluminous hood hid his eyes. He opened his mouth and began to lick the glass in a small circular motion, while his wrinkled hands rubbed the surface, producing a sharp and distressing sound. I was paralyzed for a few seconds before screaming and grabbing my phone to call the police. At that instant, he knocked forcefully on the door, turned around, and jumped over the balcony railing. When the police arrived, I described what had happened and indicated the direction he had gone. Everything occurred around 1 in the morning, as it has repeated since then. My balcony is situated at a height of about 3 stories, descending a steep cliff that overlooks a field. Although such a fall probably wouldn't kill someone, it would be enough to cause serious injuries. You'd think such an old man would break his legs jumping. Yet the police found 2 deep boot marks at the point where he apparently landed. From these marks, a clear trail emerged in the tall grass. Light footprints alternating between left and right feet followed in wide steps. He had landed, risen, and ran, apparently without a scratch. The officers followed the trail to the edge of the forest, at the boundary of my property. About 15 meters in, they discovered an improvised campsite, a brown tent, a modest campfire, and a pile of dead rodents, one of which was skewered over the flames. I informed the authorities that I didn't want that camp on my property, and they dismantled it. But almost every night since then, around the same time, he reappears. Whenever I call the police, he escapes. I bought a shotgun, determined to protect my home. I waited awake on some nights, but on those occasions, he doesn't show up. He only appears when I finally doze off. I always wake up to that unbearable sound, rough skin scratching the glass. He wants me to know he's still there, and as always, he disappears before I can act. Any attempt I make to prevent him from climbing results in some loss or damage the following day. When I removed the staircase, for example, he took my cat. Other than that, he continues to stand there on the balcony, pressing his face against the glass. I've put curtains on the doors, and since then, I no longer look outside or open the curtains. The only indication of his presence is the disturbing sound of glass being scratched. I thought about moving. I even listed the house for sale. But the next morning, I found a note made of birch bark in my mailbox. It contained detailed information about every member of my family. I immediately took down the listing. If I spend more than a few days away, when I return, I find broken windows, destroyed plants, and holes dug throughout the yard. After a week of vacation, I came back home and found all my goldfish fried in a frying pan on the stove. The police have insisted that I leave the house, but I can't tell them about the note. I'm almost certain something terrible would happen if I revealed that. Since I removed the stairs, he's become more daring. Now he enters the house even when I'm here. It seems his presence is no longer limited to the early morning hours. He's always nearby. I've caught glimpses of him, and whenever that happens, I run straight to my bedroom. Sometimes I hear the sound of the lock being manipulated, and at other times, the bedroom doors shake as if someone were holding them and shaking them forcefully. His objective is clear. He wants to enter here. For now, I feel my bedroom is safe. I'm armed with a shotgun in case he tries something. And despite him having already invaded the house, I'm convinced he won't be able to cross the barrier of my bedroom. I'm completely isolated in here. The last time I left was to fix the external stairs. Since then, I've kept the bedroom door locked. The only exit would be through the glass doors that lead to the balcony. However, I know I won't be able to hide forever. Eventually, I'll need to go out, and I'm certain he'll be waiting. If by chance he isn't, I can only pray for my family's safety. What puzzles me the most is that I know who he is. I recognized him when the police showed me the missing persons poster. Thomas Everett, reported missing from the psychiatric wing of St. Mary's Hospital 30 years ago. The same man who had attacked my grandmother in this very house before I was born. The same man whose face I'd seen in childhood nightmares years before I ever moved here. The same face that was painted in faded colors on a portrait hidden in our family's attic. The doctors said he suffered from a rare form of dissociative identity disorder, believing himself to be some kind of supernatural guardian. The police reports mentioned his obsession with keeping watch over particular families he believed were marked. My grandmother had never told me about the attack, only that the house had old memories, and that I should always keep the bedroom curtains closed at night. Now I understand why. Last week, I found something tucked beneath my door, a drawing made in what looked like dried blood, showing a hooded figure standing over a child's bed. On the back was written a single sentence: "I protected your mother. I protected you. Now they're coming and you need me. I don't know who they are. But sometimes, when he's standing outside my window, I see shadows moving in the forest edge that even he seems to watch with caution. And I wonder if, in some twisted way, he really believes he's keeping me safe from something worse. I loaded my shotgun yesterday. Not for him, but for whatever might be coming next. The scratching on my window feels almost like a warning now. Telling this story isn't easy. I have conviction that today I'm a different person, someone who has done good things and helped many people. But in my youth, I was lost, full of despicable attitudes. Around the age of 24, I got involved with the wrong crowd. I sank into parties and drugs and ended up addicted to heroin. In the beginning, it seemed like I had control of the situation. I managed to keep my job and maintain my daily routine. But as the addiction took over, I became dependent on being under the influence all the time. This cost me important friendships, my job, and eventually my dignity. I started living on the streets, resorting to theft to support my addiction. While high, I would usually be sprawled out in some house where everything seemed frozen in time. But when the effects wore off and withdrawal set in, I would transform. I would completely lose my sense of self, willing to do anything for money. I'm ashamed to admit it, but this left me in an irrational state. I remember one particularly dark night in Seattle, back in 2013. I had absolutely nothing. Desperate, I begged dealers to supply me with something even without payment, but no one gave in. Withdrawal was taking over, scrambling my thoughts. I decided to wander through the city, hoping to find something I could exchange for money or drugs. In this insane search, I ended up in an upper-middle-class neighborhood, far from where I usually roamed. I started trying to open doors of parked cars when an alarm went off. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I ran away and hid in a dark corner. There, huddled up, I spotted a house at the end of a cul-de-sac. The front door was ajar, and the warm light coming from inside seemed to call me. Like a moth attracted to a lamp, I approached and noticed that the door wasn't locked. Probably, the doormat prevented it from closing completely, and the residents thought it was secured. I looked around. Everything was silent. On impulse, I entered without thinking much. What I felt when crossing that entrance was strange. It had been years since I'd seen such a welcoming home. The environment was warm, the aroma pleasant, almost as if that place brought back forgotten fragments of memories. For a moment, I let myself go and sat on the sofa, just looking around, feeling a wave of nostalgia almost take over me. But that sensation was interrupted when I spotted a purse on the kitchen counter. I jumped up and went straight for it. Bingo! Inside the wallet, I found about $200. With my heart racing and senses on alert, I pocketed the money and prepared to leave. However, when I reached the entrance door, I froze. Right there, standing in front of me, was a little girl. She appeared to be about to close the door that I had left ajar. We remained motionless, staring at each other. Her wide eyes reflected the same surprise as mine. My mind seemed like a whirlwind, as if I were trapped on an out-of-control roller coaster, going from the purest ecstasy to absolute fear in seconds. I thought, it's over for me. However, seized by panic, as if a beast had taken control, I leaped at the girl and covered her mouth with my hand, just as a scream began to escape her lips. I was completely desperate, with a lost gaze, looking for some way out. The little girl struggled, and although my greatest fear was that she would attract attention, I didn't want to hurt her at all. I continued whispering for her to be quiet, promising I would release her if she cooperated. But I could still feel the muffled screams under my hand. Suddenly, a searing pain shot through my hand. She had bitten me. I held back a scream in my throat, and in a burst of frustration, I ended up hitting her face with my other hand. It wasn't planned, and when I realized it, she let out a small moan. She stopped trying to scream, but the damage was already done. It was then that I heard footsteps upstairs. The sound of voices brought me back to reality. Without thinking twice, I ran toward the door through which I had entered and fled to the street. As I moved away, her screams echoed behind me, calling for her father. Other voices began to emerge, adult shouts coming from the house. My thoughts were jumbled, complete chaos. At no point did I want that to happen, much less hurt her. Later, back at the decrepit house where I was hiding, I sat in that fetid place, consumed by remorse. I anxiously waited for some sign on the news, but I saw no specific mention of the incident. Still, it was obvious that someone had called the police. And what did I do next? I used the stolen money to get high again, numbing the pain for a few hours, but sinking even deeper into the well I had dug for myself. To this day, I can't forget what I did to that little girl. I imagine the terror I caused, the trauma she probably carried from then on. It's been more than 15 years since I've been sober, and each day I do what I can to balance the weight of this burden. But even so, I can only ask God to have mercy on me. 3 years into my sobriety, I tried to find that family. I wanted to apologize, to make amends somehow. It took months of searching, but I finally located their address. They had moved twice since that night. I wrote a letter explaining everything, enclosed $500, pathetic compensation, I know, and my contact information. I never expected a response, but one came. Not from the parents, but from the girl herself, now a teenager. She wrote that she remembered that night clearly. The bruise I gave her had healed within days, but the fear had taken years to fade. She said she had nightmares about a shadow man breaking into her room for a long time afterward. But somewhere in her healing process, she had found forgiveness. She didn't want my money. Her parents had intercepted the letter and had decided together that she could respond if she wished. She only wanted to know if I had really changed. We began a careful, supervised correspondence. Her parents, remarkably compassionate people, eventually agreed to a meeting in a public place. I feared their hatred, expected their rage, neither came. Instead, they showed me something I hadn't anticipated: understanding. They were both addiction counselors who had seen countless people trapped in the same cycle that had consumed me. The girl Hannah, I can say her name now, is in college studying psychology. She says that night changed the trajectory of her life. She wants to work with trauma victims to help them find the healing she did. I volunteer at her parents' clinic now. Every day I tell my story to people who are where I once was, hoping they can find their way back before they reach the breaking point I did. Some days, when the weight of my past threatens to crush me, I remember what Hannah told me the last time we met. The man who broke into our house that night wasn't really you. I'm glad I finally got to meet the real person. I don't deserve such grace, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it. This happened a few years ago when I worked at Domino's Pizza during the holiday season rush. Although my official title was customer service representative, I'd say in practice, I was more of a jack-of-all-trades in the kitchen who also answered phones. The Monday nights were an enormous contrast to the frenzied bustle of the weekends. Everything was slow, almost dragging. Because of this, my manager sent one of the main delivery drivers home early that night. I was still in training for deliveries, but I had started to take some simpler orders in hopes of being promoted to full-time driver. At almost 10 o'clock at night, just a few minutes before closing, the phone rang. I answered and repeated the standard script. "Thank you for calling Domino's. This is Jason. Would you like to hear about our specials, or are you ready to place your order?" Before I could finish the sentence, I was interrupted. On the other end of the line, a muffled and somewhat hesitant voice fired off. "Are any of your delivery drivers female?" The question immediately triggered an alert in my head. With complete calmness, I responded, "At the moment I can't take your order." From the other end, I heard a strange sound, almost like a grunt, before he finally said what he wanted. A package of breadsticks accompanied by extra marinara sauce. He gave the address, and I informed him that the delivery would arrive in 15 minutes. However, before I could hang up, he added, "Send a handsome delivery guy. He'll get a good tip." The urge to hang up was immediate, but not before I heard a muffled laugh in the background. I was uncomfortable with that disgusting comment, but already hardened from dealing with inconvenient drunks. I went straight to the kitchen to prepare the order. The breadsticks went into the oven, and I quickly got ready, putting the address in the GPS. I took the car and headed to the outskirts of town. After a few minutes, I arrived at the destination. It was an empty parking lot, surrounded by a dense row of trees. In the distance, about a quarter-mile down the road, I could see an isolated trailer. I parked on the lot and sat there without seeing anyone. I felt a weight of frustration, imagining that I could have been the victim of a stupid prank. However, before I could take another breath, I noticed something in the rearview mirror, movement. Shortly after, I heard the rear door of the car being opened. I turned my head and saw a figure approaching through the passenger door. It was only then that I realized what was happening. They were trying to get into the car. Fortunately, the engine was still running. Without thinking twice, I stepped hard on the accelerator and the car shot forward. The sound of something hitting against the car body, followed by shouts, mixed with my adrenaline. In the rearview mirror, I clearly saw one of the people falling to the ground and another running after the vehicle. At that moment, it occurred to me that they might just be homeless people. But that idea quickly vanished when I heard 2 shots being fired. Panic took over. I was driving hunched over, trying to instinctively protect myself, while the wind came in through the rear door that hadn't closed properly. My only prayer was to get out of there alive. After some time driving back to the city, thanking God for not having caused an accident, I finally stopped, trembling. I took the phone and called my manager. He tried to reassure me and said he was on his way. After calming down a bit, we went together to the police station to file a report. The next day, I found out the suspects had been arrested. To my surprise, they weren't drunk students as I had imagined. They were actually 2 criminals with extensive police records, completely high on crystal meth and armed to the teeth. Among their possessions, the police found 4 phones, which they believed had been used to make similar calls to other delivery services in the area. What really unnerved me was what they found in the trailer. A makeshift operating table with medical instruments stolen from the county hospital, several plastic sheets, and a collection of driver's licenses from 3 different states. The police wouldn't tell me much more, but an officer quietly suggested I might want to reconsider the delivery business. I took his advice. To this day, that was the most terrifying experience of my life. I never made deliveries again after that. I did, however, testify at their trial 6 months later. As they were led away, one of them looked directly at me and smiled. The kind of smile that stays with you in your nightmares. I learned later that they were suspected of being linked to at least 7 disappearances across the Northwest over the previous 2 years. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my car hadn't started that night, or if I'd been making that delivery on foot instead. I try not to think about it much. I still work in food service, but now I'm firmly on the cooking side, in a kitchen with no delivery service, multiple exits, and very bright lighting. Some lessons you only need to learn once. During a musical trip to a city in northern Minnesota, I decided to rent a bicycle late at night. My friends were partying on the other side of the city, and I wanted to join them. To save time, I chose to cross a public park, but as I approached, unsettling sounds began to reach me. I heard an argument. A female voice seemed distressed, while a male voice demanded that she be quiet. That paralyzed me in my path. My mind tried to find a more harmless explanation, but it was undeniable. A woman was being attacked by more than one man among the bushes. Although we all wish to act like heroes in moments like this, I need to be honest. I was completely frozen. Her screams were different from anything I had ever heard, filled with pain and desperation. My conscience begged me to do something, but fear told me to disappear from there before being noticed. Trapped between the decision to fight or flee, I noticed a figure approaching from the opposite side. A lit cigarette ember revealed that someone was getting close to the group. A tall, thin man with a peculiar presence. Before I could move, I heard another scream, but this time a masculine one. The man had extinguished his cigarette in the eye of one of the attackers, who fell to the ground, moaning. Without hesitation, he began to violently stomp on the man's head, each blow echoing as if the ground itself were vibrating. 2 other men ran after him. The stranger, however, ended up in a dead end near some public restrooms. The area was covered with gravel, something common in Minnesota to prevent accidents in winter. The man took advantage of the terrain and began to throw stones at the pursuers with almost unbelievable precision. Their cries of pain were unmistakable. When he finally reached them, the scene that followed was one of pure brutality. Punches that seemed capable of bringing down walls left the 2 on the ground. He knelt over the men, but I couldn't exactly distinguish what he was doing. What became clear was the silence that followed their screams. Soon after, I noticed something moving toward him. I thought it was another attacker, but it was the woman running while hastily putting on her clothes. Between tears, she thanked the man, repeatedly bowing. With a deep, almost caricatured voice, he responded, "Get out of here. Go to a hospital." Then he lit another cigarette and jumped over the park fence, fleeing as residents began to come out of their houses. I finally shook off the paralysis that had kept me immobile for so long. I got on the bicycle and prepared to leave, but before I decided to check on the 2 men in the alley. When I arrived, I found them both disfigured. The most disturbing detail: their eyes were empty, as if they had been plucked out. The tall man had taken them with him before disappearing into the night. The image haunted me for weeks afterward. I never reported what I saw to the police, partly out of fear, partly because I didn't know what to say. How could I explain that I had stood there watching and done nothing? The guilt was almost as disturbing as the memory of those empty eye sockets. A month later, while reading the local newspaper, I came across a small article about a series of assaults in the area that had suddenly stopped. The police attributed it to increased patrols, but the article mentioned a rumor circulating among the homeless population about a guardian angel who had been protecting women in the park. I might have dismissed it, except for one detail. According to the rumor, this angel collected the eyes of his victims, so they could never again look upon the innocent with evil intent. The description matched what I had seen that night perfectly. 3 months after the incident, I was back in the park during daylight hours, taking photographs for a local arts festival. As I adjusted my camera near the restrooms where the confrontation had happened, I noticed something beneath a loose brick in the wall, a small tin container. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a hand-drawn map of the park, marking specific locations with red X's. There were 12 marks in total. Beneath the map was a typed note that read, "The guilty have been judged. Their windows to sin now serve a higher purpose. Let this be a warning to those who would prey on the defenseless." I closed the container and placed it back exactly as I found it, my hands trembling. That night, I researched missing persons reports for the area over the past year. There were exactly 12 unresolved cases of men who had disappeared in or near the park, all with criminal histories involving violence against women. Sometimes when I'm out at night and I see someone light a cigarette in the distance, I wonder if it's him, this guardian or vigilante or monster, depending on how you choose to see it. I wonder if he's still out there, watching and waiting. And I wonder if I ever found myself in trouble in the dark, whether I'd fear his approach or welcome it. I've never told this story before. Part of me feels complicit in my silence, but another part understands that sometimes justice and law aren't always the same thing. I don't know if what he did was right, but I know those attacks stopped. And sometimes, in a world full of horrors, perhaps we need horrors of our own to keep the balance. My girlfriend and I were returning home on a typical Friday night in Portland, Oregon. On the way, we stopped at a red light, and two vehicles pulled up beside us. One was an ordinary old Ford sedan, and the other was a rather peculiar party bus. Since the window on my side insisted on fogging up, I kept it open despite the light rain. We sat there for so long with no traffic at all that we ended up having the opportunity to observe the bus more closely. The windows were completely tinted, something expected for this type of vehicle. But what caught our attention were the strips of black duct tape scattered across the bus. Some of them were already coming loose. Between the strips, you could see that the white paint was worn, peeling in some spots and rusted. The strangest detail, however, was the complete silence inside the bus. No music, voices, or any sign that there was a party going on. The bus seemed deserted, with no movement inside. At that moment, I thought it must be empty, perhaps returning from some event. But then, without warning, we heard desperate, piercing screams coming from inside. The sound was disturbing, the kind that makes your stomach turn. Suddenly, we stopped talking about the bus and sat there, motionless, staring at the traffic light that seemed to take an eternity to change. When the silence returned, as brief as those 10 seconds were, I felt an unsettling sensation, as if something or someone was watching us. As soon as the green light appeared, the car next to us accelerated, and we did the same. After a few minutes of driving, I tried to lighten the mood with a forced laugh. "Well, that was strange, wasn't it?" I commented, trying to appear unconcerned. "Strange," she began, but interrupted herself with an alarmed tone. "Wait, is it following us?" "It is, isn't it?" We looked around, and after taking a deep breath, we decided that the best thing would be to stop at a Wendy's, a nearby restaurant, and stay in a place full of people for a while. We spent about 20 minutes huddled at a table inside, trying to calm ourselves down. When we finally came out, we saw the bus again. driving slowly in front of the entrance to the shopping center. We decided to get in the car and go home, figuring it would take some time for the vehicle to make a complete loop around the block. That was the last time we saw it. Despite this, the memory still sends a chill down my spine. Sometimes I find myself thinking that it was all just paranoia, but I'm relieved the bus didn't follow us all the way to our house. There was something disturbing about that vehicle, an almost tangible sense of threat. I asked some friends who party more often if they had ever seen anything similar, but no one recognized the description. One of them suggested that perhaps it was some kind of art installation, a funny idea in retrospect. I can even imagine some bored hipster thinking it would be innovative. Yes, it's quite likely it was just someone's strange project with too much time and a questionable sense of aesthetics. Even so, it still bothers me to think that it circulated around there for almost half an hour while we were at Wendy's. 2 weeks later, I was scrolling through the local news app on my phone when a headline caught my eye. Abandoned vehicle investigation leads to gruesome discovery. The article detailed how police had found a white bus matching the description of the one we saw, parked in an industrial lot just outside the city. Inside, they discovered evidence that several people had been held captive there. The article was careful with details, referring only to biological evidence and restraint implements, but made it clear that investigators believed the bus had been used in multiple abductions over the past month. What sent ice through my veins was the police's theory that the perpetrators used recordings of screams to test people's reactions as they drove around. Those who showed concern or called the police were avoided. Those who ignored the screams or laughed them off were potentially marked as targets. That night, I called the police tip line and reported what we had seen. The detective who took my statement said they had received several similar calls since the news broke. When I asked if they had any leads on who was behind it, there was a long pause before he answered. "What's particularly disturbing," he said finally, "is that the bus was reported stolen from a church youth group 3 months ago. We believe whoever was using it may have been observing potential victims for some time before acting. They never caught whoever was responsible. Sometimes when I'm stopped at that same traffic light, I can't help but look around at the vehicles beside me and wonder who might be watching, testing, waiting. And I wonder how many people heard those screams before we did, and how many heard them after." The most intriguing thing is that my parents insist they don't even remember something like this happening. I was just a child in the early 2000s. It was summer, and we were at my grandparents' house located in rural Pennsylvania, celebrating what I believe was Independence Day or some similar commemorative date. The whole family had gathered uncles, aunts, and cousins that I rarely saw. The highlight of the event was the spacious backyard for games and a fire pit in the garden with a table full of varied dishes, an abundantly stocked cooler, deliciously grilled hamburgers, and the scent of smoke mixing with laughter under the watchful eye of my grandfather, who supervised everything as if he were the judge of a great competition. However, when the day was already turning into night, something unusual happened. I was the first to notice a figure emerging from the shadows of the forest behind the house. An unknown man with a disheveled appearance came staggering toward the garden. Looking more closely, I realized that his clothes were dirty and torn. He looked like a drunken drifter, both by his appearance and the awkward way he walked. I pointed in his direction, but before I could say anything, my father quickly pulled me close and shouted, "Everyone inside, now." My aunts and my mother hurried inside the house, and as we ran, I looked back, imagining that my father and my uncles would simply confront him. But to my surprise and frustration, as soon as everyone was safe, they also entered and locked the door. The atmosphere inside the house was tense, different from anything I had ever seen. My father and my older uncle, both National Guard officers at the time, seemed really apprehensive, much more than us or their wives. This was strange considering they were armed and could easily summon reinforcements. Furthermore, my other uncle was a former boxer with an impressive physique, and my grandfather, at 6 feet 7 inches tall and weighing almost 300 pounds of pure strength, was a man of intimidating presence. He seemed capable of facing anything. Despite this, everyone remained inside the house, watching the man through the window. I watched perplexed as that thin, gray-haired gentleman, probably in his 60s, wandered through the garden. He picked up hamburgers and hot dogs from the picnic table, took a bite of each, and unceremoniously threw them on the ground. Even though I was only 9 years old at the time, I felt immense anger. I didn't understand why my father and my uncles weren't doing anything. At one point, my mother asked, "Aren't you going to do something?" My father remained silent, his eyes fixed on the man outside. One of my uncles took a step toward the door, but was immediately stopped by a firm look from my grandfather. The situation reached its peak when the stranger turned over the table, spreading all the food on the ground. He then began to laugh uncontrollably, and without rushing, staggered out toward the road that led to town, but not before knocking over the grill. That was the last straw for me. Years later, I tried to revisit this episode, questioning my parents and even a cousin who was also present. However, no one remembered. My mother insists it must have been a dream, but I can't accept that. For me, it's a crystal clear memory, and I still carry the doubt about what really happened that night. What always stood out to me wasn't just the bizarre nature of the incident, but the reaction of the adults. These were men who had faced real dangers, military men, a boxer, my imposing grandfather. Yet something about this strange intruder made them retreat rather than confront him. When I was 16, I found the courage to bring it up again during a Thanksgiving dinner when everyone was gathered. The reaction was peculiar. My father and uncles exchanged glances, and my grandfather suddenly became very interested in his mashed potatoes. My mother tried to change the subject, suggesting again that I had dreamed it all up. It was my cousin Jessica who finally broke the silence. "I remember," she said quietly. "The man with the strange eyes." The table went silent. My grandfather cleared his throat and in his deep voice said, "Some things are better left in the past, especially things from those woods." No one would elaborate further, but that night, Jessica snuck into the guest room where I was staying. She was 3 years older than me and had always been the brave one. "They don't talk about it because of what happened after," she whispered. The next morning, when Grandpa went out to clean up the mess, he found something carved into the picnic table. I saw it before they flipped the table over and burned it. What was it? I asked. Names, she said. Our names, everyone who was at the barbecue. And a date 5 years in the future. I didn't believe her then. It seemed too fantastical, too much like something from a horror movie. But exactly 5 years later, to the day, our family gathered again, this time for a funeral. My grandfather had passed away suddenly in his sleep. As we stood at the cemetery, I noticed a thin, elderly man watching the service from a distance. When I pointed him out to my father, his face went pale. By the time we looked again, the man was gone. Sometimes I wonder if that strange visitor was some kind of omen or warning. Other times, I think perhaps it really was just a vivid dream that my young mind confused with reality. But then I remember Jessica's words, my father's fear, and my grandfather's insistence that some things are better left in the past. Whatever the truth may be, I've never felt comfortable at outdoor family gatherings since then, and I always keep a watchful eye on the edge of the woods. My name is Vincent. I was born in a place people tend to escape from as soon as they get the chance. In the outskirts of Detroit, where abandoned factories loom like ghosts of a prosperous past. My mother Eliza raised me and my younger sister in a small house that barely stood upright. The roof was made of old shingles, and when it rained heavily, water seeped through the corners, dripping directly onto the concrete floor. Our house stood beside a dirt road that turned into a muddy quagmire during the rainy seasons. We had no car, no motorcycle, nothing. My mother took the bus to work Monday through Saturday, a journey that took more than 2 hours each way. The house where she worked was enormous. Until then, I had only seen such places on television screens. She cleaned, ironed clothes, cooked, took care of purebred dogs, and maintained the swimming pool. Her employer was a man I rarely saw, but I knew he had many businesses and money to spare. My mother said he was always traveling to negotiate in other countries. Yet he didn't like to waste anything on employees, especially a housekeeper. Sometimes she came home saying they had deducted from her salary for arriving late when her bus broke down. Other times, she confided that she slept in a damp little room in the back when she had to work overtime, because it wasn't worth paying for another late-night bus fare. I was about 10 years old when I started accompanying her during school vacations. We slept together in a bunk bed that the house staff called the support bed. It was in a space so small that if I sneezed too loudly, you could hear it from any nearby room. The walls showed water damage with dark marks on the plaster. Sometimes there was a bucket next to the bed to catch water from leaks. The boss and his wife rarely appeared, but when the couple's children were at the house, they acted as if my mother and I were invisible. Once, the oldest boy threw me a pair of used sneakers. "You can keep them if you want. They've already ordered new ones for me," he said. I remained silent and took the sneakers. They were a bit big for my feet, but I wasn't going to refuse. I only had one pair that already had holes in them. At least these shoes wouldn't leave my toes dragging on the ground. I thanked him but felt strange. I didn't know whether to feel happy or humiliated. My mother told me I shouldn't hold grudges, that she worked there because she needed to. She always ended with some religious phrase like, "Faith sustains those who have nothing." I saw no sign of improvement in that life, but I tried to agree. As I grew older, I realized my mother was sacrificing her own health to put food on the table. She arrived home late, exhausted, with back pain. She had high blood pressure and was always postponing buying medicine due to lack of money. When she got sick, she lost days of work and consequently pay. It was an endless cycle. I finished elementary school in a public institution, full of leaks and broken windows. At 15, I got my first gig washing cars on the street because the school meals no longer sustained me, and I wanted to help at home. My mother protested, "You have to study, Vincent. If you drop out, you'll have no chance of moving up in life." I understood her concern, but how could I concentrate on books if at night there wasn't always enough food? While my classmates prepared for high school, I started looking for other temporary jobs. Construction helper, flyer distributor, bar assistant. Nothing earned me more than pocket change. It was always the minimum, and I felt angry. I looked at the mansions my mother cleaned and thought about how people with money had everything at their fingertips, and they didn't even seem to care. When I turned 17, my mother lost her job. The boss sold the house to another magnate and dismissed all the old employees. We tried to live on what I earned, but it was insufficient. We ended up living in an even smaller house in an area near overgrown wasteland. When it rained, water came in under the door. Electricity failed frequently. My mother was getting increasingly ill, and I couldn't afford health insurance or better medicines. She depended on what was available at public clinics, which frequently had nothing in stock. One day, I overheard a conversation between two colleagues while washing cars on the street. They were talking about a merchant who had allegedly made some obscure promise and suddenly become rich. In the end, they said the merchant's wife died suddenly, without explanation. The conversation was full of rumors, but that same night, I searched the internet for anything about pacts, promises, bargains. I found forum after forum, with people telling supposed accounts of rituals or superstitions. Most of these posts seemed silly to me, but over time, I found a more serious group where they discussed ancient texts, strange symbols, prayers in languages I didn't know. There were those who spoke of ways to attract money and prosperity. I also found warnings about ensuing misfortunes. I found it all rather absurd, but I was desperate, and somehow it held my attention. I started staying up late reading about these things, while my mother slept in the next room. I could hear her cough getting worse. One day, I decided to try a simple ritual I read about on one of these forums. They said to light candles, draw certain symbols, and repeat mysterious words. I bought cheap candles and locked myself in the only bathroom of the house, which also had water damage on the wall. I wrote the symbol I saw on the screen on a piece of paper. I tried to repeat what was written, but didn't feel anything different. After about 15 minutes, all that remained was the smell of burnt candle. I extinguished everything before my mother woke up. I felt like an idiot for having believed in that talk. However, something inside me told me not to give up. I read more and researched instructions for other pacts, names of entities that promised money, fame, and success. Among them, I found one that supposedly didn't ask for such terrible sacrifices. The description talked about offering something symbolic of great personal value, an object and a few drops of blood to seal the commitment. It said the entity attended to requests related to fortune, as long as the person was willing to deal with unquestionable consequences. It seemed like a simple legend, but I was intoxicated by those readings. Every day my mother got worse, and I saw the fear in her eyes. She didn't say it clearly, but I knew her health was deteriorating. I decided to follow that more serious ritual, but without telling anyone. I bought powdered sulfur and strong incense at a small improvised market. I found an ancient metal piece in a junkyard that, according to the post, could serve as a catalyst. It was a broken amulet, but in my head it seemed sufficient. I wrote down formulas, prepared a circle involving salt, turned off the lights, and at midnight began to intone what I had practiced. I mentally said everything I wanted. Money to take care of my mother, to get out of that misery. I felt my nose burn because of the incense. My forehead was sweating. At one point, I thought I heard a crack in the ceiling, but it might have just been the wood expanding. I finished the ritual, opened the living room door, and felt ridiculous again. Everything was silent. Nothing fell from the sky. No voice came to tell me I would have help. I extinguished the candle remnants and stood looking at the salt circle, wondering if it was just nonsense. Before going to sleep, my mother called me softly. "Is everything okay, son?" I heard a noise. I said yes, that I had just dropped a bucket of water. She believed me and went back to dozing, holding the pillow as if she were cold. The next day, I went door to door looking for a job. I got a position as a stock clerk in a small market. It wasn't much, but at least I would earn a little more than washing cars. I thought it was just a coincidence, but at night, in my room, I reflected on whether some ritual was actually working. Maybe this was the beginning of something. I worked at that small market for about 2 months. It was tiring. I carried heavy packages, organized shelves, and cleaned the disposal area for expired products. The establishment's owner treated me well, but the salary was minimal, and almost everything went to medicines and basic food. My mother got a little better when she could buy some more expensive pills. She even smiled when she said, "Now it seems things are going to move along, huh, Vincent?" I wished she was right, but after those 2 months, I had a knee problem from carrying boxes incorrectly. I had to take a few days off, and when I returned, the owner told me she couldn't keep someone who couldn't stay on their feet for long. I lost the job. I felt a lump in my throat, but that was the reality. I returned home limping and found my mother crying because she knew we wouldn't be able to pay the electricity bill that month. The humiliation seemed endless. It was then that I remembered what I had researched. Almost everyone on the forums said that to guarantee the pact, you needed to make a more elaborate ritual on a specific date, with some elements that demonstrated seriousness. I didn't believe it as much anymore, but a desperate part of me wanted to try again. Over the next 30 days, I prepared better. I took what was left of my money and bought better candles, a different incense, a clay cup, and a dark cloth. The right day would be during a new moon phase, and the recommended time was between 2 and 3 in the morning. My mother, exhausted, would fall asleep. I would do everything in the living room. On the appointed night, I put the cloth on the floor, arranged the candles around, traced a symbol I found in a digital file with chalk, lit incense, and knelt with the cup in my hand. I trembled a bit, but repeated the phrases I had memorized, promising to offer part of me, blood, in exchange for abundance. I made a small cut on my finger and let a few drops drip into the cup. The smell of blood mixed with that of incense. It was then that I heard a crack at the windows. It wasn't explicit, but my heart raced. Suddenly, I felt a strange heat on my back, but it could have been just my nervousness. I remained there for several minutes without speaking, without moving a muscle. Then I extinguished the candles and cleaned everything up. I thought I was hallucinating with cracks due to fear and tension. The next morning, I found my mother coughing harder than usual. I felt a pang of guilt, but didn't say anything. 2 weeks later, I found a flyer under the door announcing a vacancy at a new insurance company that was opening in the region. They offered paid training and the possibility of commission earnings. I went to the interview, and they called me to start in 10 days. From then on, everything seemed to move quickly, but in a relatively plausible way. The training lasted about a month, and I dedicated myself like never before. In a little over 2 months selling insurance, I was already receiving more than in any previous job. It seemed like something really favored each negotiation. When I received the first payment, it was clear that I would earn much more than in any other job. I was able to buy quality medicines for my mother, make small repairs to the house, and even get a new cell phone for myself. She was happy but also suspicious. Once, while I was sorting the bills, she asked, "How did you get this job so quickly?" "I saw an ad, Mom. I think I got lucky." The sales continued to rise, and in about 4 more months, I was already receiving praise from the boss, who called me a phenomenon. A colleague commented that I was the sensation of the sector. One day, I received an unexpected bonus. I bought a good fan for the house, and also replaced the roof tiles that were always leaking. It was during this time that a recurring noise started in the attic, as if there was something moving up there at night. My mother even commented, "It sounds like there's an animal running up there, isn't it?" A rat or a possum maybe. I went up and saw nothing. The flashlight only illuminated tiles and wood. There were no nests, footprints, or traces of any animal. I came back down without being able to explain. The noise could have just been the wind, but for some reason, I remembered the ritual and felt uneasy. The weeks passed, and each contract I closed yielded even more profit. I started dressing better, using expensive perfume. I bought a used car for my mother, so she wouldn't have to depend on the bus. She was emotional, had tears in her eyes when holding the key. "Is this real, Vincent? I can't believe it." Despite being sick, she thanked me as if I were a hero. But I noticed that at night, the cough returned, and sometimes it was accompanied by chest pain. She tried to hide it from me, but I could tell. I said she needed to go to the doctor frequently to get tests, but the queue was huge in our city. Even with money, some cardiological procedures required specialists in another capital, and there was little availability. I decided that if necessary, I would take her as soon as we got the appropriate date. Now I had resources and couldn't bear to see her unwell. During this same period, I began having confusing dreams. In some, I was signing sheet after sheet of paper and couldn't stop. In others, I saw myself walking in a dark place, unable to distinguish where I was. I would wake up and not remember the details, just the feeling of discomfort. I don't want to say there was something supernatural. It could have been my tired psyche, since I was working too much and carrying the weight of the household on my shoulders. Things started going very well in sales. I not only earned commissions, but the superiors noticed me and offered me the chance to manage a small team. In about a year, I had already doubled my income, and my bank account reflected a value I never imagined seeing. At this point, I moved myself and my mother to a more comfortable house with ceramic floors and a spacious living room. She still had health problems, but she was in a better place. We started to have some new furniture and a state-of-the-art stove. I could hardly believe that turnaround. It was during this time that I received a phone call. My mother had gone to a routine consultation at a private clinic. Her doctor requested urgent tests. I scheduled and paid for them. We received the news that she needed a cardiac procedure that wasn't simple. After that, she was hospitalized for 2 weeks. It seemed that her body was getting weaker. On the 5th day of hospitalization, I sat beside the bed holding her hand. She touched my arm and asked, "Are you happy, son?" "I am, Mom." "You're going to get better. We'll sort everything out." She gave a small smile, but her expression said there was something troubling her. She didn't speak but let slip, "I feel afraid." I spent the night in her room, sleeping in a hard chair. When it was almost 4 in the morning, I woke up to her accelerated breathing. I called the nurse, who asked for calm, but in a few minutes her heartbeat plummeted. I was in shock. They tried to revive her, brought equipment, shouted instructions, but nothing worked. It was a quiet dawn. A doctor entered and didn't take long to shake his head in a negative sign. I felt empty. My mother had passed away. I stood for a while, not crying, just a huge emptiness. It was as if the hospital walls were closing in around me. I went through the wake, burial, bureaucracy. I spent everything that was needed and didn't care about values. I blamed myself because despite having helped her financially, I couldn't prevent the disease that consumed her. It wasn't a simple exchange. Seeing her go, I remembered those old readings where they said someone always paid the price. I wondered if there was any connection to the crazy pact I had tried, but I thought it was just life being cruel as always. Even so, in the few hours of sleep I managed, I dreamed that my mother was looking at me without saying anything, as if she wanted to ask me why. After the burial, I returned home without spirit. I didn't even start the car. For the following days, everything seemed indifferent to me. My team at work sent me condolence messages and gave me time off. I spent the days looking at the wall. The house was full of things I bought for my mother: an orthopedic mattress, a closet with soft bedding. She didn't have time to enjoy them. This tightened my chest. When I went back to work, I noticed that my sales continued surprisingly high, almost as if the universe had opened an infinite door of clients. One side of me was relieved because I wouldn't have financial problems, but I felt dirty for caring about money amid the loss I had just experienced. To make matters worse, I began to have the impression that some colleagues at the office looked at me strangely, as if I were someone who rose too quickly. Some asked questions: "How do you sell so much, Vincent?" Or "Do you never make mistakes? It's always success after success." I deflected without knowing how to explain. A part of me felt disconnected from it. as if the victories weren't really my merit. One night I arrived home late, sat in the living room, and picked up an old photo of my mother smiling. I had a vague impression of hearing footsteps in the hallway. I got up to look, but there was no one. Unintentionally, I remembered the creaks I used to hear in the roof. I decided to check the hallway, and everything was in order, with no signs of invasion. The next day, a colleague from work who gave me a ride told me a curious comment. "I heard you lost your mother. My condolences. But I also heard that you got an inheritance from a distant relative. Is that true?" "No, that's a lie." "Then how did you get so much money in such a short time?" I turned my face to the window. I didn't want to say there were rituals, pacts, and ideas that I myself didn't understand. I preferred to remain silent. After that, some deals started to happen without me lifting a finger. Brokers approached me offering partnerships, and the commissions were already signed before the meetings. Every day, I received calls from companies interested in closing contracts. It was as if something was making my path easier. I felt a mixture of gratitude and disgust. I started drinking more frequently, arriving home drunk, throwing my jacket on the couch, and passing out in the bedroom without strength. Before sleeping, my thought returned to remembering the ritual. Did that really have power? And if it did, what price would still be charged? One weekend, I went to a company award event. Everyone praised me. Some directors came to congratulate me personally. I received a symbolic trophy as a sales highlight. After the ceremony, I went to a bar with some employees. They celebrated, but I couldn't. A woman approached, introduced herself as Carla, saying she also worked in insurance and that I was a national phenomenon. She invited me to another place, but I refused, saying I was tired. I left thinking about my mother. Alone in the car during the journey, I thought I saw someone sitting in the back seat through the rearview mirror, but it was just my eyes heavy with sleep. I stopped the car on the shoulder, took a deep breath, and proceeded slowly home. A few days later, I had insomnia and was rummaging through drawers. I found my notebook with the packed notes, along with that broken metal amulet. A strange pulsation ran through me. I decided to throw everything away. I opened a garbage bag and stuffed in the notebook the amulet, the clay cup, the candles that were still left. I took it outside and left it near the sidewalk. I thought I would feel better, but upon returning, the room still had the same heavy atmosphere. I tried to ignore it and went asleep. In the early morning, I had a nightmare where the house seemed full of muffled voices. The following weeks were confusing. The company promoted me to an even higher position, which earned me a generous fixed salary plus benefits. I moved to a larger house with a garden and space to receive visitors. I hired a housekeeper twice a week. However, I never felt comfortable. I had the impression that something was missing, and sometimes I heard small noises, as if the floor was creaking even though no one was stepping on it. Once the housekeeper commented, "Strange things have been happening here, Mr. Vincent." I closed the windows, but when I return, they're open. I shook my head saying I didn't know anything about it and just asked her to continue working. The truth is that I avoided thinking. I threw myself into work, lived surrounded by meetings and money, but arrived home and slept poorly. One Saturday, I took the car early and drove to our old neighborhood. I wanted to see how things were. I passed in front of the house where I lived, now with even more peeling walls. The roof was partially broken. Some neighbors saw me, waved, but I didn't get out of the car. They seemed curious to know how I had become so well off. I preferred not to talk. I felt a tightness in my chest and left. This visit affected me. I remembered my childhood, my mother asking me never to give up on studies. I also remembered how I had begged for money, for a chance. Maybe I had succeeded, but something important was lost along the way. Whether it was coincidence or destiny, I'll never know. Life went on, and for a time, I tried to push away any thoughts about pacts. Even without speaking, I feared that it was affecting my mind. Sometimes I dreamed of my mother lying in an empty place, and I tried to call her. Other times, it seemed like I was talking to someone who had no face, asking them to leave me in peace. I would wake up sweaty, confused, not knowing if it was just stress or something beyond. A few more months passed, and I noticed a drastic change in the market. The insurance companies I worked with began to suffer investigations for alleged irregularities in contracts. Many clients canceled their plans or broke terms for fear of fraud. The board began to pressure everyone, including me, to reverse the situation. In about 2 months, I was no longer receiving half of what I used to. Then came unexpected costs, lawsuits, and the company began to suspend payments. The tide seemed to turn all at once. I held on to the little I had left, but my expenses were already high. The larger house required taxes and maintenance. My investments devalued along with the crisis in the sector, and nothing I did prevented the financial hole. I spent sleepless nights wondering if there was some way to undo whatever I had called into my life, but I had already discarded everything. Maybe it was too late. With my reserves dwindling, I had to sell the house and return to a smaller place, almost as modest as where I lived before becoming rich. It wasn't the same slum I left, but a simple neighborhood without much comfort. A sense of failure passed through my head, but at the same time, something relieved me for being far from that big house that kept frightening me. For a time, I was unemployed, surviving on small, informal consultancies, because I had experience in sales and insurance. My golden period passed like a flash. I no longer received calls from directors or invitations to highlight events. The few colleagues who remained asked if I was okay, but didn't have much to offer. I began to reflect on everything. If there was really a supernatural influence, I had attracted something that brought me easy money, and in return took my mother, my peace, and finally everything I had achieved. If it was nothing like that, life had given me a chance and taken it away soon after. In either case, the result was the same. I was back to square one, but now without the most important person by my side. I thought about reopening those forums and looking for some kind of breaking ritual, but deep down, I thought it better not to. I had already paid a high price. Besides, I had thrown away all the material related to it. So I let time pass. I used my last pennies to open a small service business, offering support to smaller offices, organizing payment spreadsheets, taxes, and documentation. Nothing glamorous, but it fed me. I won't lie, I still have strange dreams from time to time. I wake up with that impression that my mother is watching me, that she is sad about something I did. On other days, I receive an email or a call from some old colleague commenting that they miss my sales performance. I clear my throat, respond with something bland, and end the conversation. I have no desire to return to that world. Everything around me has normalized to a mediocre level. I have little, but at least I no longer deal with mysterious noises in the roof or disturbing sensations in the hallways. The word peace may be too big, but I am calmer. From time to time, I question whether I really invoked something, or if the coincidences of life gave me a quick opportunity and then sank me. Some nights I have nightmares and wake up sweating, feeling like I've awakened from a long journey. I drink water, look at the walls of the simple house where I live, and feel smaller than before, without family, without luxuries, but with the certainty that it might be the best I can have now. In the end, the question that remains in my mind is, was it worth it? I always come to the same conclusion. No, it wasn't worth it. There is no triumph that pays for losing someone you love, or the tranquility of sleeping without starts. Today, I live on what I earn in my modest business. I've learned a lot about myself, and perhaps about the world. I still feel a pang in my chest every time I see news of people who suddenly become very rich. I can't prove anything, but something inside me always remembers that to gain, you must give something in return. And if that something is precisely our happiness, I no longer know if it would be worth the risk. To this day, I keep some photos of my mother in an envelope. I no longer display them because they leave me with too much longing. Sometimes I think it's not fair. She suffered her whole life. She deserved to have lived longer to see if things really got better for us. But life doesn't read our rules. If there is any supernatural force interested in exchanging benefits, it doesn't offer guarantees either. Today I can only tell my story so that no one repeats the same mistake, and to remember that money without peace means absolutely nothing. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.